There is a short animated film from 2006 that most people have never seen. It is crude in the way that very early web animation tends to be, sketchy and fast and made without the kind of budget that would buy you a decent lunch, let alone a professional animation team. The two characters at its center are immediately, uncomfortably recognizable to anyone who knows the show, even though they have different names at this version, because the voices coming out of them are the voices you already know. The older one has the burp, that rolling, slightly slurred quality that sounds like intelligence and dysfunction living so close together they have become genuinely indistinguishable from each other, one feeding the other until you cannot tell which is the source and which is the symptom. The younger one has that specific anxious register, a voice that always seems to be slightly ahead of itself with worry, always balanced on the edge of some approaching catastrophe, always about 4 seconds away from something going fundamentally wrong. And the film that contains these two characters, this small 4-minute piece that was submitted to a monthly short film festival by a young animator who was absolutely certain he was about to receive a legal letter from a major Hollywood studio, is, without much competition, one of the most deliberately offensive pieces of content ever submitted to a venue that was nominally about comedy. The jokes in it are not incidental provocation, they are the point. The offense is the whole project. The creator made it that way on purpose. He wanted the lawsuit. He did not get the lawsuit. What he got instead, 7 years later, was one of the most popular, most argued about, most culturally magnetic animated series in the history of American late-night television. A show that would attract what many observers described as the most passionate and simultaneously the most toxic fandom in contemporary animation. A show whose creators would face multiple serious and well-documented public controversies. A show whose audience would literally riot over a fast food dipping sauce in a Los Angeles parking lot while police watch. A show whose writers would be doxxed and threatened and have their personal information published online by people who claimed, with astonishing sincerity, to be protecting the show's quality. A show whose central voice actor and co-creator would be removed from the production under circumstances the industry had not encountered before, and has not entirely figured out how to categorize since. All of it, in chronological order, from the very beginning to the present. That is what we are doing tonight. So get comfortable, turn the lights down if they are not already down, pull whatever you have around you a little closer. If you have not yet subscribed to Dimension Drop, it genuinely does help us keep making these long, quiet, deep dive essays that are designed for exactly this kind of night, when what you want is someone talking you slowly through something complicated and interesting and true while the world gets quieter. We will be here for a while, and the full story of Rick and Morty, every controversy it has generated in the order those controversies actually unfolded, is worth taking the time to tell properly. The first thing you need to understand about Rick and Morty is that its existence is itself a kind of unlikely accident. Not in the sense that it nearly did not happen, but in the sense that it arrived through a chain of events that were not directed toward any particular destination. Nobody planned for this specific show to emerge from this specific sequence of provocations and frustrations and creative accidents. It grew in the way that some things grow through obstinacy and luck, and the specific chemistry of two people meeting at the right moment with the right complementary limitation. Justin Roiland, in the middle years of the 2000s, was a young animator, writer, and voice actor working in Los Angeles without having found the form that was meant for him. He had worked as a production assistant and in various capacities adjacent to the entertainment industry he wanted to be part of, doing the peripheral work that a lot of young creatives do while waiting for the right door to open. He was funny and strange and possessed of a very specific kind of aesthetic sensibility and appetite for content that was deliberately uncomfortable, that went to places polite entertainment avoided, that treated transgression not as a side effect of creativity, but as a creative tool in itself. He was also, and this matters for the story that follows, someone who processed conflict through humor, who had developed the instinct to push against whatever authority or legal or institutional structure was in his way. Dan Harmon had co-founded in 2003 a monthly short film festival in Los Angeles called Channel 101. The concept was simple in structure and turned out to be genuinely effective in practice. Anyone could submit a short film in the format of a television pilot with a maximum running time of 5 minutes. At the end of each month, a live audience voted on which pilots they wanted to see continue and which they wanted to eliminate. The format was deliberately Darwinian in the way that the best creative institutions often are, selecting not for production value or polish or appeal to imagined demographic profiles, but for something rawer and harder to define. The quality of material that either landed in a room full of real people who had chosen to be there on a given Monday evening, or it did not. Roiland had been submitting pilots to Channel 101 since roughly 2004, a year after the festival launched, and Harmon had been watching him. Roiland's submissions tended toward what might charitably be described as aggressive aesthetic transgression. He was not making content designed to make an audience comfortable. He was making content designed to produce a reaction somewhere between bewilderment and genuine alarm, content that occupied the space where comedy becomes something else and then decides to stay there. Not all of it worked. Quite a lot of it confused the audience in ways that did not generate the desired response. But there was a quality to it, something in the instinct in the voice and the absolute refusal to approach any premise from a direction that felt safe, that Harmon found worth sustained attention. In 2005, Roiland made a series called House of Cosby's. The title tells you essentially everything. The series animated a world in which clones of a very famous comedian were created and multiplied, each clone possessing a different one of the comedian's well-known attributes and ability. There was the eating clone, there was the dancing clone, there was the clone whose function was entirely comedic, and then there was the clone whose function the show never quite explained to anyone's satisfaction. The series found a modest but genuine online audience and developed the kind of cult momentum that the early web was beginning to be capable of generating for content that would have had no viable distribution channel even 5 years earlier. Podcast culture and early video sharing platforms were creating space for things that the mainstream entertainment industry would never have greenlit. It was also, legally speaking, a problem waiting to be resolved by someone else's lawyer. A cease and desist letter arrived from the famous comedian's legal team. The series was shut down. Its story ends there, except for what it taught Roiland about what an institutional response to his work could actually look like. Roiland processed this experience not as a warning, but as an insight. The idea that you could make something and have it removed by the legal apparatus of celebrity was, to his particular way of thinking, a form of curation that was at least as interesting as being celebrated. It was also, as a creative challenge, a puzzle. He was interested in the specific mechanics of how a thing got taken down, and what would happen if you made a thing specifically designed to be taken down, if the provocation were the whole point and the legal response were the completion of the project rather than its termination. And so he decided in the autumn of 2006 to make something specifically and consciously designed to attract a cease and desist from a studio considerably more powerful than his previous target. He would parody a beloved franchise. He would do it in the most nakedly provocative way he could conceive. He would submit it under a title deliberately constructed to function as a copyright violation notice, and he would wait. The franchise he chose was Back to the Future. The studios involved were Universal Pictures and Amblin Entertainment. The parody he made featured characters identifiable as Doc Brown and Marty McFly in a relationship that was, at its most direct level, the precise inverse of the warm mentorship dynamic of the source material. The older character's time travel was not a gift but a leverage mechanism. The relationship between the two characters was not guidance and growth but something considerably darker and more explicitly transgressive. He changed the name slightly to create a thin veneer of technical distance. The older character became Doc Smith. The younger one became Hardy McDonald. The adjustment, whose apparent purpose was less legal protection than maintaining the quality of bad faith that was the project's entire aesthetic stance. He submitted the film to Channel 101 in October 2006 under a title specifically constructed to invite a lawsuit. Universal's legal team never contacted him. What happened instead, and this is the part of the story that justifies telling the rest of it, is that something occurred in the edit that Roiland had not planned for. He started listening to the voices. This is his account of the origin of the show, offered in various interviews across the years, and it has the quality of a story that is true in the sense that matters, even if the specific details shift across retelling. He was in the edit for this deliberately offensive parody. This project he had made specifically to attract legal trouble, and he found himself paying attention to the voices he was performing for the two characters. The older character's voice had a quality he had not fully noticed while he was making it, a rolling, slurring quality that came from his impression of Christopher Lloyd, but which had acquired in the actual recorded performance something additional, something that was not quite an impression anymore. The voice communicated intelligence running at a speed that slightly exceeded the capacity of coherent speech. Thoughts is always outrunning words, and intelligence that was also somehow its own worst enemy, always spilling over into the spaces where coherence lived. The burp, the distinctive vocal tick that would become one of the most widely imitated sounds on the internet a decade later, began as a genuine accident. Roiland kept it because it was right, because it made the voice sound like someone whose ideas were always carbonating upward from somewhere underneath the word, always threatening to overflow the container, trying to hold them. The younger character's voice had something too, an anxious sincerity that was also underneath it, a kind of hope that the world might eventually be less terrifying than it presented itself as being. The relationship between the two voices had a dynamic that felt real in a way the context did not deserve. Roiland made 3 more short films with variants of these characters over the following years. The voices became sharper. The relationship between the characters became more defined, more specific, more like the outline of something that could sustain longer and more complex storytelling. The characters were renamed. Doc Smith became Rick Sanchez. Marty McDonald's became Morty Smith. The obscene premise of the original film was abandoned. What remained was the essential quality of the dynamic, the impossible genius and the complicit innocent, the intelligence that destroys everything it touches, including itself, and the boy who follows along partly out of fear and partly because following along is at least a form of purpose. When Dan Harmon was approached by Adult Swim about developing new programming, sometime around 2011 or 2012, he thought immediately of Roiland and of those voices and of the specific dynamic that had been developing at Channel 101 over several years. The two of them began developing what would become Rick and Morty. The challenge of the development process was that the show had to do several things simultaneously and not let any one of them undermine the others. It had to be funny because it was going to be a comedy on a comedy network. It had to be a science fiction adventure series with enough narrative engine to sustain seasons of storytelling. It had to have the quality of genuine philosophical seriousness that Harmon in particular was drawn to. The sense that underneath the chaos, there were real questions being asked about real human problems, and it had to be capable of allowing genuine consequence to accumulate, of not always hitting the reset button at the end of an episode and returning everything to zero. The pilot episode was developed over roughly a year. The central characters were redesigned. Rick was given a family, a daughter named Beth, and a son-in-law named Jerry, and grandchildren named Summer and Morty, which gave the show's central relationship a domestic context and a set of supporting figures who could carry weight of their own. The time travel of the original films became interdimensional portal travel, which turned out to be considerably more flexible for storytelling because it did not carry the narrative constraints of time paradox. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim on December 2nd, 2013. The pilot attracted just over 1 million viewers, which was a strong number for the time slot. The first reviews were immediately and genuinely positive. Critics noted the show's originality and its unusual tonal range, its willingness to deploy genuine emotional stakes inside an essentially comedic structure in a way that most animated series avoided. By the time the first season concluded in April 2014, the network had already renewed the show for a second season. The audience was growing fast. The conversation about the show was shifting from whether it was good to exactly how good it might become. The show that was developing in real time was doing something structurally unusual. Most episodic television of its type operated on a reset mechanism, meaning that whatever happened in an episode, the situation returned to its original configuration before the credits rolled. Rick and Morty used a reset mechanism too, but it would occasionally and deliberately choose not to press it. Certain consequences accumulated, certain emotional beats were real and stayed real. The character of Rick Sanchez was not being offered as a protagonist to identify with, but as a subject of examination, a figure whose extraordinary intelligence was being presented not as a virtue but as a burden, something that had cut him off from connection and meaning, rather than enhancing his access to them. That examination would be conducted with varying degrees of success across the show's entire run. But in the first season, it was mostly fresh and mostly working, and the audience was arriving in increasing numbers to watch it. The first major controversy the show generated did not come from the people who made it. It did not come from a production delay or a creator's personal behavior or a fan base that had lost perspective. It came from the content of an episode in the first season that asked its audience, suddenly and without warning, what kind of show they were actually watching. The episode, called Me Seeks and Destroy, aired on January 20th, 2014. It is the 5th episode of the first season, and it is, by a significant margin, the most discussed and the most argued about episode in the show's first 2 seasons. It is also, in retrospect, the episode that established most clearly what the show was capable of when it was operating at full strength. The conversation around it set a standard against which every subsequent controversial choice the show made would be evaluated, whether the show met that standard or fell short of it. To understand why the episode divided people, you need to understand its structure. The episode uses the split plot format that Rick and Morty employs frequently throughout its run, 2 storylines developing simultaneously in parallel, with their own internal logic occasionally intersecting at moments moments that illuminate both by their juxtaposition. The first storyline involves Jerry Smith, the show's most comprehensively put upon character. Jerry is a fundamentally decent man whose decency exists in a context that has no use for it. His children regard him with various degrees of exasperated affection. His wife Beth regards him with a mix of genuine love and slowly accumulated disappointment that neither of them has fully articulated. His father-in-law Rick regards him with an open contempt that Jerry has not developed a way to process because nothing in his previous experience has prepared him for it. Jerry is not stupid, he is simply not extraordinary, and in a household organized around Rick's extraordinary genius, not being extraordinary is experienced as a form of failure. Rick, before heading off on the episode's secondary adventure, gives the family a device he has constructed. It is a box with a button on it. When you press the button, a blue humanoid creature called a Mr. Meeseeks pops into existence. The Meeseeks exist for one and only one purpose: to complete whatever task the person who summoned him has assigned. The moment the task is done, the Meeseeks dissolves contentedly. The moment the task is not done, the Meeseeks continues to exist, and the experience of continuing to exist without completing the task is, for the Meeseeks, what's suffering. Jerry summons his Meeseeks and assigns the task of improving his golf handicap. Specifically, he wants to take 2 strokes off his game. The Meeseeks attempts to help. Jerry's golf game does not improve. The Meeseek, unable to complete the task and therefore unable to stop existing, begins to deteriorate under the weight of continued existence. He summons another Meeseeks to help. That Meeseeks summons more. The situation multiplies with a desperate inevitability. Eventually, a room full of increasingly destabilized Meeseeks are confronting the fundamental problem of Jerry's unreformable relationship with his own limitation, and they begin to seriously discuss murder as a potential resolution to their suffering. It is the most logical thing they can think of. This half of the episode is very funny. The Mr. Meeseeks character, with his signature philosophical lament about the pain of existence for creatures like himself and his absolute single-minded urgency about task completion, became one of the show's first genuine breakout characters. He appears on merchandise to this day. The joke about consciousness experienced as an emergency that will only end when its assigned purpose is achieved, about existence itself as a problem rather than a gift, landed with a precision that revealed something about the existential texture of modern adult life that most comedies preferred not to acknowledge. The second half of the episode is entirely different in tone and in what it is willing to do. In this plot, Morty has grown tired of Rick's approach to interdimensional adventure. Rick's adventures tend toward the catastrophic. They tend toward mass death and reality-threatening scenarios, and the systematic humiliation of Morty's confidence and his sense of physical safety. Morty proposes a bet. If Morty can choose an adventure and lead them through it successfully, one that is simple and fun and does not result in trauma or existential crisis, Rick will agree to stop criticizing Morty's judgment for a full year. Rick agrees, somewhat contemptuously, on the assumption that any adventure Morty chooses will go wrong in some way that will prove his point. Morty's chosen adventure takes them to a fairy tale world, the kind of place that exists at the intersection of children's illustration and European folk tale aesthetics. There is a medieval tavern with a working fire and straw on the floor. There is a village of people living simple, pre-industrial lives. There is a monarch. There is the whole aesthetic of a story that is supposed to be safe and legible and resolved by the final pages. The adventure goes wrong in small ways almost immediately, but not in the ways either Rick or Morty anticipated. Rick is constitutionally incapable of being a cooperative partner in anything he has not chosen himself, and his running commentary on the inadequacy of Morty's adventure generates the kind of low-level friction that has been building between them throughout the episode. At the tavern, after an argument about Rick's attitude, Morty goes to the bathroom alone. He is frustrated and a little embarrassed and needs a moment away from Rick's relentless presence. In the bathroom, an anthropomorphic jelly bean introduces himself. He is large, and the animation gives him a quality of warmth and sociability that reads as simple friendliness at first. He expresses interest in Morty. He comments on the evening. He makes physical contact that is, at first, within the range of ordinary social interaction in a context where strangers sit together in tavern bathrooms and make conversation. And then the contact does not end the way ordinary social interaction ends. The scene's tone shifts, not suddenly, gradually and then inevitably. In the way that situations of this kind shift in reality, what is happening becomes clear. And then it becomes worse. Morty fights back. He escaped. The episode does not describe in detail exactly what happened, but it does not need to. The animation, the sound design, and the subsequent behavior of every character in the room communicate exactly what occurred without requiring explicit statement. Morty comes out of the bathroom visibly different. The animation tracks it carefully. He is moving differently. Something has settled over him that is not going to lift quickly. He asks Rick to take them home. He concedes the bet. He tells Rick the adventure failed without saying why it failed. Rick, without asking questions, without requiring explanation, reads the situation in a single look. His expression changes in a way that reveals something about his capacity for love that most episodes were not yet showing. He moves Morty toward the portal. As they leave, Rick turns and kills the jelly bean through the closing portal. It is a single shot. There is no announcement, no speech, no moment of explicit moral weight. It is a quiet act of retribution for something that has not been named, handled with the specific emotional precision of a person who understands what happened and what it requires without needing it to be said aloud. The post-credits scene goes further. Two villagers discover photographs in the jelly bean's private belongings. The photographs are incriminating in ways the scene does not show directly but communicates clearly. The jelly bean, it turns out, was their beloved king. He was an institution. He was revered. The two villagers look at each other and look at what they have found and make a decision. They burn the photographs. They agree that the people will get more from the king he represented than from the truth about the jelly bean he actually was. They protect the legacy. This is a precise statement about institutional cover, about the way communities and structures and organizations prioritize the reputations of powerful figures over the experiences of the people those figures have harmed. It is a statement that had accumulated considerable resonance in the public culture of 2014, and that would accumulate more in the years that followed. The show made this statement in a post-credits scene, in a world populated by cartoon jelly beans, which is either a testament to the show's willingness to embed genuinely serious social commentary in absurdist contexts, or it is an example of using absurdity as armor, saying something difficult while keeping the safety of the joke available if the difficulty becomes too much. The episode divided its audience immediately. A substantial and vocal portion of the audience felt that what they had watched in the bathroom scene was the moment the show proved it was doing something different from most animated comedy. The refusal to find a punchline, the specificity of the emotional aftermath, the quiet intelligence of Rick's response, the post-credits commentary on institutional complicity, and the protection of powerful abusers. These elements were pointed to as evidence that the show had genuine moral seriousness underneath the chaos. Critics, writing their episode reviews, used words like brave and surprising and genuinely moving. Many viewers who had been watching the show as a smart, somewhat dark comedy revised their understanding of what the show was prepared to do in both directions. A different portion of the audience felt that including sexual assault in a comedy, however carefully handled, was a category error the show would have been better off not making. The argument was not always coherent in its specific, partly because it had to navigate the question of why graphic violence that appeared repeatedly throughout the same episode was acceptable while this was not. The honest version of the objection usually came down to a feeling about context and expectation rather than a principled argument about what content was inherently impermissible. Some viewers simply did not want to encounter this material in this setting and felt that their understanding of what they had been watching had been violated. A third and smaller response, which emerged primarily from critics and more analytically inclined viewers rather than from general audience commentary, engaged with the episode on its own terms but questioned whether it followed through on what it had begun. Rick and Morty was already, in its first season, a show that made jokes about the accumulated psychological damage of its characters' adventures. The fact that the most explicitly traumatic event depicted in the show to that point was not returned to, not worked into Morty's ongoing characterization in any direct way in the episodes that followed, felt to some observers like the show had been braver in depicting the event than it was prepared to be in examining its consequences. Justin Roiland addressed the episode in the period following its broadcast, in online posts and in interview. He was clear that the scene was intended to be exactly what it appeared to be, realistic and horrible and absolutely not played for laugh. He offered a genuine and detailed apology to anyone who had been reminded of their own experiences by watching it. He maintained that the intention was to make a statement about the reality of sexual assault rather than to use it as a mechanism for generating dramatic tension cheaply, and he acknowledged that the question of whether he had achieved that intention was one each viewer would answer based on their own relationship with the material. The debate settled, over time and over subsequent seasons, into a general critical consensus that the episode had handled genuinely difficult material with more craft and more care than the show's reputation at that early stage had prepared viewers to expect. but the episode left something in place that would shape the show's relationship with its audience for its entire run. It established an expectation that when Rick and Morty went to genuinely dark places, it would go there honestly, without the safety net of irony deployed at the exact moment when the content became most uncomfortable to sustain. That expectation, once established, became the measure. Every subsequent controversial choice would be evaluated against it. Season 1 concluded in April 2014. Season 2 arrived 16 months later, in July 2015. The 16-month gap generated the first wave of impatient fan commentary, which was itself a sign of how quickly and how deeply the show had embedded itself in the emotional lives of its audience. 16 months between seasons is, in the context of contemporary animated television production, not a long time, but the audience was not evaluating it against production standard. The audience was evaluating it against want. Season 2 was widely praised. It deepened the show's mythology in significant ways, introducing elements that would become central to the show's larger architecture over the following season. It demonstrated that the tonal achievement of the first season had not been a fluke, that the show could sustain the balance between comic absurdity and genuine emotional weight across a full second run. It included some of the most admired individual episodes in the show's history up to that point, and it ended in October 2015 on a cliffhanger of real emotional weight. Rick, who had spent the season oscillating between genuine heroism and genuine selfishness and genuine self-destruction, found himself in a position where the consequences of his choices had finally accumulated beyond his ability to simply portal away from. The season ended with Rick in custody, Morty's life disrupted, and the central relationship between the two characters left in a state of genuine uncertainty that most animated series would never attempt. Then came the wait. Not the 16-month wait, the real wait. Between October 2015 and the proper premiere of Season 3's remaining episodes in July 2017, 21 months passed. In terms of what was happening to the show's cultural footprint, during those 21 months, the more relevant number is that the show was absent from screens for the better part of 2 years, while the internet's engagement with it continued to accelerate rather than dim. The Rick and Morty fan base did not simply wait patiently during this period. The online communities that had developed around the show continued to grow, to generate content, to argue about meaning and quality in the show's cultural significance, and to develop increasingly strong and specific ideas about what the show was and what it owed its audience. These communities were shaped by a dynamic that had become characteristic of internet fan culture in the mid-2010s. The absence of new material from the original source, combined with the continued presence of derivative material, commentary, memes, fan theories, and the shared vocabulary of the fandom, created conditions in which the community's understanding of the show could drift considerably from the show's actual content. The Rick Sanchez character was the specific site where this drift was most significant and most consequential for the controversies that followed. Rick in the show itself was always being examined critically. The show understood that his intelligence and his damage came from the same source. The nihilism was not offered as wisdom. The alcoholism was not offered as a signifier of genius. The contempt for lesser minds was not offered as a virtue. The show repeatedly demonstrated with genuine narrative and emotional craft that Rick's relationship with his own intelligence had not made him happy or good or whole, that it had in fact cut him off from the things that might have made him those things, and that the specific form his damage took was deeply entwined with his specific gifts. The meme versions of Rick that proliferated during the 2-year hiatus did not contain this critical frame. They contained the surface, the disdain, the refusal to defer, the posture of unconstrained genius, the contempt for social norms presented as a form of clear seeing rather than as a symptom of damage. These qualities could be performed in online spaces with very little commitment to the actual complexity of the character from whom they were derived. They could be adopted as personality template by people who had identified with what they took to be Rick's freedom rather than examined what the show was saying about the cost of that freedom. Over 21 months without new episodes to complicate and deepen the picture, these versions consolidated. The communities around them developed specific values about what Rick and Morty was, specific assumptions about its audience, specific defensive reactions to anything that seemed to threaten the version of the show they had invested in. And when the 3rd season arrived with changes behind the scenes that those communities perceived as challenging to their understanding of the show, the responses reflected how deeply and how specifically they had built their identity around a version of the show that the show itself had never entirely been. The Season 3 premiere appeared without announcement as part of Adult Swim's annual April Fool's broadcast on April 1st, 2017. It was a single episode, a surprise drop that resolved the cliffhanger from the season 2 finale with characteristic energy and set up the central concerns of the new season. The episode, titled The Rickshank Rickdemption, included in its closing minutes a sequence that would trigger the most commercially strange event in the show's history. In the final scene, Rick delivers a monologue about his deepest motivation. The audience has been waiting 21 months to understand what is driving him, what the series arc of a character this complex actually is. And what Rick revealed, with extraordinary passionate sincerity, is that what he wants most in the universe is a specific McDonald's dipping sauce from 1998. A limited edition teriyaki sauce released as a promotional tie-in with Disney's animated film Mulan and discontinued when the promotion ended. A sauce that had not been available for almost 20 years and that most of the audience had entirely forgotten existed. The joke is built on the gap between the grandeur of Rick's intelligence, which the show has spent 2 seasons establishing as genuinely extraordinary, and the complete triviality of what that intelligence has been in service of all along. Rick Sanchez, genius, nihilist, destroyer of worlds, and rebuilder of civilizations, wants a dipping sauce, not in a metaphorical sense, not as a symbol of something deeper. He just wants the sauce. The comedy is in the absolute literalness of the desire, and in what it reveals about the gap between how Rick presents himself and what is actually driving him. The audience did not receive it as a joke about that gap. The audience received it as an instruction. The McDonald's Szechuan sauce situation of October 2017 is one of those events in cultural history that you have to describe carefully and completely, because even people who lived through it sometimes struggle to fully believe the sequence of events actually unfolded the way it did. After the season 3 premiere and the now notorious Rick monologue, a petition on change.org calling for McDonald's to bring back the Szechuan sauce gathered tens of thousands of signatures within hours of the episode airing. This was, on its own terms, remarkable. A limited dipping sauce that had been discontinued for nearly 20 years was suddenly the subject of a coordinated campaign by a television show's fan base. The speed and intensity of the response said something about the show's cultural saturation and about the specific nature of the audience's relationship to it. But it was also simply surprising. McDonald's corporate chef Mike Harat responded to the petition on social media. He wrote something to the effect that he would see what he could do. This response was almost certainly an off-the-cuff acknowledgement from someone caught off guard by an unexpected level of online attention. The kind of casual social media engagement that a food company's representative might offer to any unusual trending topic without intending it as a commitment of any kind. The audience received it as a commitment. McDonald's, presumably evaluating the potential press value of a nostalgia-driven fan service gesture tied to one of the internet's most discussed television shows, eventually announced a one-day only limited return of the sauce on October 7th, 2017. The announcement was explicit in describing the limitation. It would be available at a small number of participating locations. The supply would be genuinely limited. The distribution would be uneven. The sauce was a promotional item being offered at scale that had not been planned or prepared for. The audience did not absorb these limitations. The night of October 6th into the morning of October 7th, fans began arriving at participating McDonald's locations across the country. At the location on La Brea Avenue in Los Angeles, crowds formed before dawn. By the time the location opened on the morning of October 7th, hundreds of fans dressed in Rick and Morty merchandise were lined up around the block. Some had driven from outside the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Some had traveled from other states. The crowd was organized with an intensity of purpose that was usually associated with sporting event tickets or concert presale, not with fast food promotional condiments. The location had received a very limited supply of the sauce. By multiple accounts and across different sources, the exact number is uncertain, but reports consistently describe quantities in the range of tens of packets rather than thousands. The sauce ran out almost immediately, within minutes of the location opening its doors. The crowd's reaction when the announcement came that the sauce was gone was not the calm disappointment of people who had understood this was likely. It was the reaction of people who felt they had been promised something and had that promise broken. Reports from the scene, confirmed by video footage that spread widely on social media, described pushing and shoving at the entrance, physical altercations, the crowd pressing toward the front doors in a mass that the employees inside had no capacity to manage or redirect. Chants referencing the show echoed through the parking lot, which had taken on the character of a demonstration rather than a customer line. The Los Angeles Police Department was called. Similar scenes unfolded at locations in Florida and in the San Francisco Bay Area. None of the other locations reached the specific intensity of the La Brea situation, but the pattern of frustrated crowds, understocked locations, and chaotic scenes was consistent across multiple cities. One fan in another part of the country had managed to obtain a single packet of the sauce. He traded his car for it. The transaction was documented and reported. Adult Swim released a statement making clear that the promotion had been entirely McDonald's initiative, that the network had not coordinated with the restaurant chain, and that they were not affiliated with what had unfolded. Roiland posted his own message on social media, expressing that he was not happy with how McDonald's had managed the situation and specifically asking fans to be kind to the employees behind the counters who were not responsible for the supply problem and who were having, as he noted, a very difficult day. McDonald's apologized. They announced that in February 2018, they would do a nationwide return of the sauce, distributing 20 million packets across every location in the country. The February return unfolded without incident of any kind. The Szechuan sauce incident was covered extensively in the media, most of the coverage framing it as evidence of how extreme and irrational the Rick and Morty fan base had become. That framing was accurate in its way. The event was extreme by any ordinary measure of adult behavior. People had camped overnight and driven across state lines and, in at least one case, traded their car for a packet of promotional dipping sauce. But the incident rewards more careful examination, because it was not simply about the intensity of fandom. Intense fandom generates unusual behaviors all the time, and most of those behaviors are harmless, even if they are strange. The Szechuan sauce situation was different because it demonstrated something specific about a failure of reception, about the gap between what the show was doing and what a portion of the audience had understood from it. The joke in the Rick monologue was not about Szechuan sauce, it was about Rick. It was about the specific comedy of a character who presents himself as unconstrained genius, discovering that his unconstrained genius has been in service of a trivial, nostalgic desire. The joke worked because the show understood that Rick's attachment to the sauce was absurd. It was a joke about intelligent people being driven by the same mundane desires as everyone else, about the performance of sophistication, concealing exactly the kind of irrational consumer loyalty that sophisticated people like to believe they have transcended. The people who rioted in the McDonald's parking lot had watched that joke and experienced it not as a commentary on the absurdity of Rick's desires, but as a directive to act on Rick's desires. They had not watched a show examining the gap between how smart people present themselves and how they actually behave. They had watched a show that told them what to want, and they went and wanted it, with a commitment and a physical urgency that the show itself, in any of its better moments, would have recognized as exactly the kind of behavior it was trying to examine. The gap that is visible here between the show being made and the show being received by certain parts of its audience would become considerably more consequential and considerably more harmful in the weeks that immediately followed the sauce incident. The same months during which the Szechuan sauce situation played out, the third season of Rick and Morty was airing with one significant change behind the scenes. Dan Harmon had made a deliberate effort to address a gender imbalance in the writing room that had characterized the show's first two seasons. The first two seasons had been written almost entirely by men. For season 3, Harmon brought in 4 female writers: Jane Becker, Sarah Carboner, Jessica Gao, and Erica Rosby. This gave the writing room, when the 2 creators were not counted, something close to a 50-50 gender split. Season 3 was the strongest work the show had done. This is not a disputed point. The season received the show's best reviews up to that point. It attracted the show's largest audience. It won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, the first Emmy the show had received. The episode Pickle Rick, written by Jessica Gao, became a genuine cultural phenomenon on its own term, generating merchandise and meme and sustained critical attention that extended well beyond the show's existing audience. Critics praised it specifically for the quality of its psychological insight, for the precision with which it used an absurd premise to examine the way brilliant people use their brilliance as a mechanism to avoid the emotional vulnerability that genuine human connection requires. The harassment campaign against the female writers began while the season was still airing. On 4chan and in certain Reddit communities, the personal information of the new female writers was published: home addresses, phone numbers. The purpose of publishing this information, in the context in which it was published, was to make the targets accessible to anyone who wished to threaten or harm. The writers received hate mail. They received death threats. They received extensive messages explaining, in registers ranging from contemptuous to explicitly threatening, that their presence in the writing room was understood as a corruption of the show they were accused of having degraded. The framing offered by the people engaged in the harassment, to the extent that they offered coherent framing rather than simply abuse, was that the new writers had been hired to satisfy diversity requirements rather than on the basis of demonstrated talent, and that their episodes had been noticeably worse than the work produced by the all-male room of the first 2 seasons. seasons. Neither claim had any evidentiary support. The season produced by the writing room that included these women was, by every critical and audience measure, the show's best work. The specific episode most frequently cited as evidence of continuing quality, Pickle Rick, was written by one of the women being threatened. The discovery of this fact, when it circulated, did not change the behavior of the harassers. Dan Harmon addressed the situation publicly in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. He used the word loathe. He said he loathed these people, meaning the people engaged in the harassment campaign, and he was clear that he meant it without qualification. He described their behavior as personally offensive to him, characterizing it as the combination of people whose primary self-defining attributes were their race and gender, with a sense of ownership over his creative work that they had not earned and did not deserve. He acknowledged the uncomfortable reality that a show popular enough to reach large audiences would inevitably reach some people whose values were antithetical to everything the show was trying to do. But he did not use that acknowledgement as a reason to minimize what was happening. He said specifically that he loathed the people who were screaming about protecting his work while threatening the women who were actually making it better. What Harmon did not do in that interview, and what the critical coverage of the time did not fully do either, was address the broader culture at Adult Swim that had produced the conditions in which the harassment was predictable. Adult Swim's programming slate in 2016 had included 0 female creators across its new and returning show. A senior executive at the network had reportedly made statements to the effect that when women are involved in a writer's room, you get conflict rather than comedy, though the specifics of who said what and in what context were disputed. The culture that the show's most toxic fans were acting out was not emerging from nowhere. It was emerging partly from the specific atmosphere that Adult Swim had cultivated and maintained over years of male-dominated creative leadership. The harassment of the season 3 writers was part of a larger pattern. Similar campaigns had targeted women in video games. During the Gamergate controversy a few years earlier, similar campaigns had targeted women taking roles in franchise films and writing for other genre properties. What distinguished the Rick and Morty version was the specific irony of its context. The show was, in its best moment, explicitly examining the pathology of a certain kind of intelligent, contemptuous male who uses his intelligence to avoid examining his own damage. The people harassing the female writers had absorbed that character not as a cautionary figure, but as a role model. They were performing the thing the show was critiquing. The woman who wrote Pickle Rick, the episode the harassers loved most, was one of the women they were threatening. She had made their favorite episode of the season while they were sending her death threats. The recursiveness of this is not an irony the show planned, but it is an irony the show at its best would have recognized. The harassment campaign against the season 3 writers was the first major controversy directly involving the show's broader audience. The next major controversy arrived in the first days of 2018 from a very different direction, and it implicated one of the show's 2 creators directly and personally. On New Year's Eve of 2017, Dan Harmon posted something on social media describing the year that had just ended as the year of the asshole, and noting that this self-characterization included himself. It was the kind of oblique public self-criticism that Harmon occasionally produced, the kind that acknowledges something without specifying it, that positions the author as self-aware of his own failures without requiring him to name them. Megan Gans saw the post. Gans had worked as a writer on Community during Harmon's tenure as showrunner. She had gone on to have a successful career writing for other shows, including Modern Family and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. She quote tweeted Harmon's New Year's message and replied with 4 words, "Care to be more specific?" Then a second message. Redemption follows allocution. Allocution is a term from criminal procedure, referring to the formal statement a convicted person makes about their offense, typically prior to sentencing. Gans was using it deliberately. She was not asking for a general apology. She was asking for an accounting. She was asking him to name what he had done with the specificity that genuine accountability requires, because accountability without specificity is often just the performance of accountability rather than the thing itself. The public exchange that followed played out on social media over several days. Harmon acknowledged that he had been filled with regret about having abused his position, that he had treated Gans in ways he would never have treated a male colleague, that he was deeply sorry for what he had done. He also, at one point in the exchange, asked Gans to tell him what she needed from him and how he could make it right, a request that itself generated significant secondary criticism. People watching the exchange pointed out that asking the person you harmed to direct the process of your own accountability is another way of centering your own emotional needs in a situation that is not about your emotional. It puts the labor of your redemption on the person you wronged, which is the kind of thing someone who has not fully understood the dynamic they participated in might do. The fuller account came several days later at a live recording of Harmontown, Harmon's podcast, with Gons present and listening. Harmon delivered a lengthy statement that described what had happened between them during their working relationship on Community. The clinical description he offered was that he had been attracted to a writer over whom he held direct authority as showrunner. He had known, he said, that acting on those feelings was wrong. His response to that knowledge was not honesty or directness, but what he called the cowardest, easiest, laziest possible thing, which was to not address the feelings at all and instead to root the discomfort they created into the texture of his daily professional behavior toward her. He had given her worse assignments. He had criticized her work more harshly than its quality warranted. He had been a bad boss and a bad colleague in ways that were specifically directed at her. He had gotten away with it, in his words, by not thinking about it, and he would have continued not thinking about it if she had not forced the issue publicly. He acknowledged that he had lost his job and damaged the show over what he had done. Gans responded on social media the day after the podcast aired. She described the specific experience of hearing him confirm that what she had lived through had actually happened, that she had not imagined, that the professional misery of that period in her life was not the product of her own sensitivity or misperception. She called the apology a masterclass. She accepted it. The exchange received extensive coverage from journalism and criticism outlet, partly because it was genuinely unusual in the context of the period. The dominant pattern in similar public situations had been denial, or partial acknowledgement, without the acceptance of the power dynamic or acknowledgement of specific behaviors framed in ways that reduced their severity. Harmon's statement was specific. It named what he had done with enough detail that the shape of the conduct was clear. It accepted the full weight of the power imbalance without offering mitigating context that would diminish it. Whether the specificity and quality of the apology was sufficient to justify Harmon's continued position on the show was a question discussed extensively in the coverage and never resolved by consensus. People who believed accountability required consequences at the professional level found Adult Swim's decision to retain him inconsistent with whatever principles the network claimed to hold about workplace conduct. People who believed the apology represented genuine accountability, and that the matter had been resolved between the two people most directly involved, found demands for professional consequences without the consent of the person who had been harmed difficult to justify on the facts. Adult Swim kept Harmon on the show. Production continued. The specific uncomfortable juxtaposition of this moment is worth naming directly. In the autumn of 2017, while the Megan Gons situation was building toward its public resolution in January 2018. Rick and Morty's third season was airing to its best ever review. The show that Harmon was running at the exact time he was acknowledging workplace harassment was producing, under his direction, some of its most emotionally sophisticated and critically acclaimed work. The episode that best exemplified the season's quality, Pickle Rick, was written by a woman. The season's quality had been enhanced by the very commitment to diversifying the writing room that had attracted the harassment campaign. The show that Harmon was making was, in its best moments, examining the pathology of brilliant people who use their brilliance to avoid being held accountable for how they treat others. The person making that show had used his position to harm someone who worked for him and had spent years not thinking about it. This is not a paradox that resolved. It is a fact about the specific kind of person that creative life in certain industries produces and protects. Someone whose awareness of human damage is most visible and most precise in the work, and considerably less visible and less precise in the life. 6 months after the Gans exchange, in July 2018, the second major Harmon controversy of the year arrived. Harmon was at San Diego Comic-Con, where he had been appearing to promote the show following the announcement of the 70-episode renewal deal, when a video from 2009 began circulating on social media. The video had been made for Channel 101, and then removed by Harmon himself relatively quickly after its initial posting, apparently because he had recognized almost immediately that whatever he had been attempting, the result was something that should not remain publicly available. It had not disappeared, because the internet does not work that way. The video was called Derek. It was a parody of the Showtime drama Dexter, in which Dexter Morgan is a serial killer who operates according to a moral code that directs him to target only other killer. In Harmon's version, the premise was modified. The central character traveled back in time and sexually assaulted the infant versions of future serial killer, on the theory that disrupting their development at the earliest possible point would prevent the crimes they would grow up to commit. The comedy, if that is the right word for what Harmon was attempting, was designed to parody the sympathetic murderer framework of the source material by pushing the premise to its most grotesque logical extent. Harmon appeared in the video himself. He was partially undressed. He used a baby doll to simulate the assault his character was performing. The video included dialogue in which the character described himself explicitly in terms that named what he was doing without euphemism. Harmon had posted it to Channel 101 himself, with a disclaimer describing the content as explicit and offensive. He had then taken it down. Both the posting and the taking down had occurred years before anyone outside of Channel 101 had any reason to be aware of the video's existence. When it resurfaced in July 2018, the timing was the immediate context of a very large announcement about the show's future. Harmon deleted his Twitter account while the coverage was in circulation. He and Adult Swim released separate statements within a short period of each other. Harmon's statement was unqualified in its apology. He described having made a pilot that had striven to parody Dexter and had only succeeded in offending. He said he had recognized immediately that it was too distasteful and had taken it down. He said that nobody should ever have had to see it and he was genuinely sorry. Adult Swim's statement acknowledged that the content demonstrated poor judgment that did not reflect the type of material the network sought out. It noted that Harmon had recognized the mistake at the time, that he had apologized, and that he understood there was no place for that kind of content at the network. The statement did not remove him from the show. The response to the two statements was complicated by an event that had occurred a few weeks earlier. Disney had removed James Gunn from directing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 after conservative commentators organized a campaign that surfaced offensive posts from his social media history. The comparison between Disney's response and Adult Swim's response became a reference point in discussions about consistency, though the comparison was itself contested. The content involved in the two situations was different in important ways. The circumstances of creation were different. The history of the two individuals was different. Whether these differences were sufficient to justify different institutional responses was a question that did not resolve into consensus. What the record shows is that Harmon made a video in 2009 that he himself recognized as having gone somewhere he did not want to go. He removed it. He apologized for it without qualification when it resurfaced 9 years later. He remained employed by the show he co-created throughout. Two major public apologies within a single calendar year, two separate categories of behavior: the sexual harassment of a subordinate and the creation and posting of an obscene and deeply offensive video, both acknowledged directly and without mitigation. No institutional professional consequence at the level of employment. Whatever conclusions one draws from this, and the conclusions available, depend significantly on what framework of accountability one applies. The accumulation is part of the record, running in parallel with the moral controversies, and in some ways enabling their worst consequences by creating the conditions in which the most toxic fan-tidies behavior developed. Was the show's troubled relationship with its own production schedule. The gaps between seasons of Rick and Morty were, for most of the show's run, unusually long. The first season concluded in April 2014, and the second premiered in July 2015, a gap of 16 months. The second season concluded in October 2015, and the third began in earnest in July 2017, a gap of nearly 2 years. The third season concluded in October 2017, and the fourth premiered in November 2019, a gap of over 2 years. Season 4 concluded in May 2020, and Season 5 premiered in June 2021. Season 5 concluded in September 2021, and Season 6 premiered in September 2022. These gaps, particularly the 2-year ones, were the structural context within which the most serious fan behavior problems developed. 2 years is, in the culture of internet fandom in the mid-2010s, an extraordinary amount of time to sustain the intensity of engagement that the most invested Rick and Morty fans were sustaining. In the absence of new material from the actual show to complicate and deepen the picture, the meme versions of the characters and the abstracted version of the show's themes consolidated a kind of cultural authority that the actual show had never granted them. The production delay controversy had its own specific flashpoint. In early 2018, months after the season 3 finale and months after the announcement of the 70-episode renewal, the show had not yet entered production on season 4. Harmon confirmed in a podcast conversation that the season had not yet been formally ordered by the network, meaning that writing had not begun. This confirmation came in the context of a Twitter exchange with a fan who had called him a lazy alcoholic and appeared to be making a comparison to George R.R. Martin's famously delayed novel. Harmon's response was that the delay was the result of contract negotiations and had nothing to do with his personal productivity, and that no amount of fan pressure would alter the corporate timeline. This was accurate. It was also transparency that created new problem because it confirmed the existence of a delay without explaining its causes in a way the audience could engage with, and because the phrase about fan pressure changing nothing landed badly in an audience that had constructed the belief that their engagement and their demands were meaningful forces shaping the show's future. The specific cause of the long delay between the 70-episode announcement and the actual premiere of Season 4 was, according to subsequent reporting and various statements from people involved, a combination of factors. The negotiations required to formalize a commitment of that scale were genuinely complex. The two creators had very different working styles and different levels of day-to-day engagement with the show, which created coordination difficulties. An animated television production is a slow process when done to the standard the show aspired to, requiring script, storyboard, recording, animation, and post-production cycles that add up to significantly more time than a live-action show. None of this explanation was available to the audience while it was happening. What was available was a silence where episodes should have been, and the silence was an incubation chamber. The most toxic elements of the fanbase had time during these extended hiatuses to develop their hostility, to refine their grievances, and to channel them toward anyone they perceived as responsible for the delay, or as a threat to the show they believed they owned. The production delays were not in themselves a moral controversy. Nobody was harmed by the time it took to make television, but they were the conditions within which the people who harassed the female writers and staged the sauce riot developed the specific orientation that made those behaviors possible. Impatience and entitlement, sustained over years and amplified by online culture's tendency to make emotional responses feel collectively validated, produced something considerably more damaging than frustration. The events of January 2023 changed the show's trajectory permanently. NBC News published its report on Justin Roiland on January 12th. The report revealed that Roiland had been charged in Orange County, California, with 1 felony count of domestic battery with corporal injury and 1 felony count of false imprisonment by menace, violence, fraud, and deceit. The charges were connected to an alleged incident in May 2020 involving a woman he had been in a relationship with. He had been arrested in August 2020 and posted $50,000 bail. He had pleaded not guilty at his arraignment in October 2020. The case had been conducted under semi-sealed status and had not attracted public attention. The show had continued production through all of that time. Season 6 had aired and concluded in December 2022. Roiland's attorney issued an immediate statement saying that his client was innocent, that media coverage was inaccurate, and that the matter was expected to be dismissed once the district attorney completed its Adult Swim released its own statement on January 24th, 12 days after the NBC News report. It stated that the network had ended its association with Justin Roiland, that Rick and Morty would continue, and that the talented and dedicated crew was hard at work on Season 7. The brevity of the statement was itself a communication. The network had made a decision and was communicating it without elaboration or invitation to debate. Hulu announced the severance of its relationship with Roiland the following day, recasting his roles in Solar Opposites and Koala Man. Squanch Games announced his resignation. On March 22nd, 2023, the Orange County District Attorney's Office announced that the charges had been dismissed for insufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. The spokesperson noted that significant additional information had come to light. Roiland posted a statement describing himself as deeply shaken by what he called horrible lies, expressing disappointment in those who had judged him without knowing the fact and declaring his intention to move forward and restore his reputation. The institutional severances held. Adult Swim, Hulu, and the other parties maintained their decisions. Their communications made clear that the employment standard and the criminal prosecution standard were different thresholds with different purposes. The debate about whether those decisions were appropriate given the dismissal of the charges was and remains a genuine one. The person who believes Roiland was treated unfairly has a real argument. Criminal charges were filed. Those charges were not proven. The defendant's career was effectively ended before any adjudication. The person who believes the decisions were appropriate also has a real argument. Criminal dismissal for insufficient evidence is not a finding of innocence. The prosecutorial language about additional information coming to light pointed toward ambiguity rather than exoneration, and corporate accountability and and criminal accountability have always been and should remain separate consideration. Dan Harmon, in a Hollywood Reporter interview after the January announcement, described his reaction as one of frustration, shame, and heartbreak. He spoke about the way the trust that builds between a show and its audience can be used as a mechanism to cause harm to people who came to the show in good faith. The show that these two men had made together was, at its core, a show about the harm that unchecked power causes in relationships between people who care about each other. It was a show that examined, with genuine precision, what happens when the person with more power uses that power to damage rather than protect the person with less. The relationship between Rick and Morty was built on exactly this dynamic, explored across multiple seasons with more honesty than most narratives are willing to sustain. The fact that both creators of this show had their own relationships to dynamics of harm and power, each in different ways and different registers, is not a coincidence that can be left unremarked. The September 2023 report from NBC News arrived in a specific context. Roiland had publicly stated his intention to restore his reputation. He had characterized the charges as lie. He was speaking about returning to creative work. The report was based on interviews with 11 women and non-binary people who had shared thousands of messages exchanged with Roiland between 2013 and 2022. 9 of the 11 said that Roiland had turned the exchanges sexual. 3 said they had been 16 years old when the communications began. The people who came forward provided NBC News with photographs, videos, social media posts, emails, and receipts as corroborating documentation of their account. The report described a consistent pattern in how Roiland had allegedly initiated and managed these contacts. He would find young fans through social media platforms and dating applications, often beginning with exchanges about Rick and Morty or his other work. The conversations would shift in the accounts of the people interviewed toward explicit content that the people involved had not sought. Messages shared with the news organization included language that referenced the youth of the people he was communicating with while continuing to sexualize the exchanges. One specific allegation in the report described a forced sexual encounter involving a woman who was 20 at the time of the alleged incident in 2019. NBC News reported that it had corroborated her account through a third party she had spoken with immediately after the alleged event. Roiland's attorney called the allegations false and defamatory, and declined to provide specific responses to the individual claims described in the report. The September report operated differently in the public conversation than the January one had. The criminal charges had been dismissed. The major institutional decisions had already been made. There was no comparable announcement to await or respond to. What the report provided was a different kind of documentation, not of a single alleged incident, but of a pattern spanning the entire life of the show that had made Roiland famous. The timeline of the alleged conduct began in 2013, the year Rick and Morty premiered, and extended through 2022, the year before everything became public. The question of whether every specific allegation in the report is accurate cannot be answered from outside the factual record. The report was published by a serious journalism organization. The corroborating evidence it described was extensive. The people who came forward had done so at personal cost and without obvious benefit to themselves. Roiland's attorney denied the claims without addressing their specifics. Whatever the complete truth of the September report, its effect was to foreclose the trajectory toward rehabilitation that the March dismissal of criminal charges had opened. The picture the two reports painted together, the criminal charges and their dismissal, and then the detailed alleged pattern of conduct toward young fans, was a picture that no single exculpatory development was going to simply erase. Season 7 of Rick and Morty premiered on October 15, 2023, with Ian Cardone as Rick Sanchez and Harry Belden as Morty Smith. Both names had been kept secret through weeks of promotional material that had featured their voices without identifying whose they were. Adult Swim had maintained the secrecy with notable discipline, neither confirming nor denying the names in response to the extensive speculation that the trailer had generated. The decision to pursue sound-alike performers rather than celebrity casting was, according to the people who made it, a deliberate theory about what the audience had actually bonded with. The theory was that the characters, not the specific voice performers, were the object of the audience's attachment. The characters were, in this analysis, real enough in their own right that an audience that had followed them across 6 seasons would be able to follow them with different voices performing them, provided those voices were close enough to make the characters feel continuous rather than replaced. For most of the audience, the theory proved approximately right. The premiere arrived and most listeners found that Cardoni's Rick sounded like Rick, that Belden's Morty sounded like Morty, that the characters were recognizably themselves. After a few episodes for most viewers, the adjustment became manageable and then eventually stopped being an adjustment at all. For a vocal portion of the audience, the change was unacceptable regardless of how accurately the voices approximated the original. Social media commentary described the absence of something that Roiland's natural improvisational quality had contributed, a certain spontaneity in the performance that came from his tendency toward genuine, in-the-moment exploration rather than scripted precision. Some fans specifically expressed disappointment that a voice actor named Sean Kelly, who had developed an online following for the accuracy of his Rick and Morty impressions, had not been cast. Dan Harmon, describing the fan response to the new voices in an interview with Gizmodo, characterized the reaction as roughly analogous to what he had expected. He described what he called the silent majority as the larger group, people who were willing to accept that the show was continuing and the characters were still the character. He described the loudest opposition as having, in his phrase, an air of religious zealotry, insisting the voices were unignorably different when most listeners were saying, in effect, that they sounded close. Season 7 received the show's lowest critical and audience scores on major review aggregator, and the specific pattern of the audience scores suggested at least some degree of organized negative review bombing by fans who objected to Roiland's removal regardless of the documented reasons for it. Whether the season's underlying quality was actually lower than previous seasons, or whether the scores primarily reflected the disruption and the organized response to it, is a question that requires more distance and more seasons to evaluate honestly. Cardoni and Belden, in interviews following the season, spoke about the experience of taking on roles under circumstances that were extraordinary by any measure. Both expressed gratitude for the opportunity alongside a clear awareness of the weight of what they had been given. Belden described finding his rhythm with the character of Morty around the 4th or 5th episode, a point at which the performance began to feel inhabited rather than imitated. Cardoni described the process of becoming comfortable with Rick as ongoing. The production situation for seasons 7 and 8 was, by most accounts, more stable and more efficient than the equivalent periods for earlier seasons. The coordination difficulties created by Roiland's multiple simultaneous commitments, which had been a factor in the long delays between earlier seasons, were no longer a constraint. Season 8 was reported to be fully written and in active production, while Season 7 was still airing. For a show that had previously been measured in 2-year gaps, this represented a meaningful structural improvement in how the production operated. The show had survived. This was not guaranteed when the situation began in January 2023. There were real questions about whether an animated series whose 2 central characters were both voiced by its co-creator, a co-creator who had just been removed under serious circumstances, could continue in any form that would retain the audience. The fact that it continued and that the characters retained enough of their essential quality to make the continuation feel genuine rather than merely nominal was a credit to the sound alike casting approach and to the writing team that continued to develop the characters with the same intelligence and care they had brought across the show's previous 6 seasons. Sitting with the full history of this show, from the deliberately offensive parody film in 2006 all the way through the recast premiere in October 2023 and beyond, what keeps coming into focus is a question about the relationship between what art is doing and what audiences receive from it. Rick and Morty was made at its best as an honest inquiry into a specific kind of human damage. The character of Rick Sanchez was constructed as a portrait of what happens to intelligence that is not accompanied by wisdom, to genius that is not accompanied by the capacity to love without conditions attached. The show knew, with genuine precision, that the same qualities that made Rick extraordinary also made him destructive. The nihilism was damage, not clarity. The alcoholism was symptom, not signifier. The contempt for everyone he regarded as less capable was the specific defense mechanism of someone who had found the world's indifference to his intelligence unbearable and had responded by becoming indifferent to everything. The show depicted all of this with real care. It showed Rick's capacity for love and his systematic destruction of every relationship in which he allowed himself to show it. It showed the way the same gifts that allowed him to reshape reality also prevented him from sitting quietly in a room with people who mattered to him. It showed the specific loneliness of having the ability to see very clearly and not having the wisdom to know what to do with what you see. Some portion of the audience watched this show. They received the complexity and the critical distance and the genuine compassion for a character whose damage the show refused to romanticize even as it made him entertaining. They watched the moments when the show chose not to press the reset button and allowed consequence to accumulate. They understood what the phrase wooba, luba, dub, dub actually meant when the show revealed its translation years into the run, and felt the retroactive sadness of all the times they had watched it used as a catchphrase of enthusiasm. Another portion of the audience watched something else. They watched a show that they understood to be telling them that Rick's way of being in the world was correct, that intelligence was a sufficient credential for contempt, that the refusal to care about anyone's opinion but your own was freedom rather than isolation, that the person who liked the dipping sauce more than they liked anyone was the smartest person in the room. They watched a permission structure rather than an examination. And when the show threatened to not be the permission structure they had decided it was, when it hired women who wrote excellent episodes, when it asked for patience, when it declined to simply be what the meme version had promised, the response was hostility. The toxic events in the show's history came predominantly from this group: the harassment, the sauce riot, the organized contempt for creative decisions they had not been consulted about. None of it was the show's fault in any direct sense. You cannot control who absorbs your work and what they do with it, but the gap between what the show was doing and what certain corners of its audience were receiving from it was visible and real and consequential in ways that went beyond minor fan unpleasant. The creator's own controversies sit alongside the audience controversies in complicated relation to each other. Dan Harmon made a show about the specific damage done by people who use their intelligence and authority as justifications for treating others badly, while using his own position to treat someone who worked for him badly, and acknowledged this with unusual precision when confronted with it. Justin Roiland gave his voice to a character whose charm was inseparable from his manipulativeness, and whose genius was inseparable from his capacity for harm, and faced documented allegations that described him as having used his fame as a mechanism to pursue young people in ways that his attorney denied and that the available evidence complicated. These are not simple coincidences. The show was about something, and the people who made the show were, in ways that the show itself understood, the subject of what the show was about. Rick and Morty has survived everything described in this video. It survived the 2-year hiatuses that cultivated the worst of its fanbase's tendencies. It survived the harassment campaigns and the dipping sauce riot. It survived 2 major public apologies from one of its creators in a single year, and the complex question of institutional accountability that followed both. It survived the removal of the voice and co-creator who had been present at its origin. It survived the recast and the review bombing and the ongoing debate about whether the show that continues is the same show that began. It keeps being made. The characters keep existing. The writers keep finding the specific register of the show, the way it holds absurdity and genuine feeling in the same breath, the way it refuses to let a joke be only a joke or an emotional moment be only an emotional moment, the way it keeps returning to its central question about what you do when you are smart enough to see the world clearly and not wise enough to know what to do with what you see. The answer the show keeps offering imperfectly and inconsistently but with genuine effort is that you stay in the relationship even when it costs you, that the person who follows you through a portal is worth more than whatever you could find on the other side alone, that the love you refuse to name because naming it makes you vulnerable is still love, and the damage you do in its name is still damage. And the question of how to hold those two things together is the question that makes the show worth watching. Dimension Drop has been sitting with this history for a long time, and the honest conclusion is that it does not resolve into a lesson or a verdict or a clean moral. It resolves into a picture of something genuinely valuable and genuinely complicated, made by people who were limited in ways that the show they were making understood better than they did, received by an audience that was, at its best, exactly the audience the show deserved, and at its worst, a demonstration of exactly what the show was warning against. The controversies are part of the picture. So is the work. Both of those things are true. Neither cancels the other, and the accounting is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is has not looked at all of it. Get some rest. If you have enjoyed the video and you want to keep up with what Dimension Drop makes, subscribing genuinely does help, and we will see you in the next one. The culture of Channel 101 deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of how Rick and Morty came to exist, because the festival shaped both Harmon and Roiland in specific ways that show up in the show's DNA. Channel 101 was not simply a venue for screening short films. It was a community with its own aesthetic values, its own understanding of what made content interesting, and its own tolerance for material that would have been rejected by any conventional gatekeeping institution. The monthly format meant that creators were constantly producing, constantly failing in public, constantly refining their instincts based on the reaction of a live audience that was not being polite about what worked and what did not. This was formative for both of them. Harmon had founded the festival partly out of frustration with the conventional development process, with the way network television selected for conformity and punished the kind of creative risk that interested him most. Channel 101 was his answer to the question of what a creative environment would look like if it selected for something other than commercial safety. The answer, as it turned out, was something that selected for a very specific kind of weird intelligence, the kind that was more interested in making an audience uncomfortable than in making them comfortable, more interested in saying something true and strange than in saying something marketable and familiar. Roiland fit this environment naturally. His early Channel 101 submissions were not successful in the conventional sense of winning continued votes from the audience. They were often too strange or too unpleasant or too committed to ideas that the audience was not prepared for. But they were interesting in a way that was harder to define and more valuable than simple success. They showed a creator who was thinking about content differently from everyone else in the room, who had a genuine instinct for the edge of tolerable that was not simply about provocation for its own sake, but about finding the place where provocation was also revelation. The relationship between Harmon and Roiland that developed through Channel 101 was not, by most accounts, a conventional creative partnership in which two equals contributed equally to a shared vision. It was more like a recognition between two very different kinds of intelligence that they could make something together that neither could make alone. Harmon brought a structural intelligence, an understanding of how story works at the level of underlying architecture, and a specific kind of literary seriousness that his comedy always carried alongside its irreverence. Roiland brought voices and instincts, and a specific kind of creative fearlessness that did not think much about consequences. The combination turned out to be exactly what the show required. The 7 years between Doc and Marty and the premiere of Rick and Morty were not years of continuous development toward the show that eventually aired. They were years of Roiland continuing to make strange things at Channel 101 and in various other contexts, gradually refining the voices and the dynamic that had emerged from that first offensive parody, while Harmon was developing his career in ways that would eventually lead to the conversation with Adult Swim that produced the show. When the development process finally began, both of them brought years of specific preparation that had not been directed toward this show in particular, but that turned out to have been preparing them for exactly it. The specific way the Rick Sanchez character was abstracted during the hiatuses deserves careful examination because it explains something important about where the worst fan behavior came from. The character of Rick in the meme versions was not a simplified version of the character from the show. It was a version that had been systematically stripped of the qualities that made the show's examination of him interesting and useful. The Rick in the show was visibly suffering. The nihilism was not equanimity. It was a defense mechanism deployed against genuine pain, and the show consistently showed the pain underneath the defense. When Rick said that nothing mattered, the show was simultaneously showing you the things that mattered to him and the ways he was destroying them because caring about them made him vulnerable. The drinking was not freedom. It was self-medication. The contempt was not clarity. It was armor. None of this made it into the meme versions. The meme, Rick, said that he was a genius and that therefore his judgments were correct and that anyone who disagreed was simply less intelligent. The meme Rick's nihilism was permission, not wound. The meme Rick was the fantasy version of the character, the one who got to be unconstrained and correct and contemptuous, without any of the costs that the show depicted the actual character paying constantly. This fantasy version was enormously appealing to a specific demographic, young men who found in it a validation of their sense of intellectual superiority that the world around them was not providing. The show's Rick was a cautionary figure. The meme Rick was an aspiration, and the audience that had been marinating in the meme Rick for 2 years between seasons was not entirely watching the same show that the writers were making. This created a specific tension when the third season arrived. The third season was, in terms of critical reception, the show's best work, but it was asking more of its audience than the meme culture version of the show had prepared them for. The season wanted to deepen Rick's damage and complicate its treatment of him. to show more of the cost alongside the spectacle. The portion of the audience that had come to the show through the meme version experienced this as a deterioration in quality. They were looking for confirmation of the fantasy and finding instead the show that had always been there but that they had not previously been required to engage with directly because the hiatus had protected them from. The female writers were a useful target for this displaced frustration because targeting them allowed the hostile portion of the fan base to explain their dissatisfaction as an external cause rather than as a failure of their own reception. The show had not changed in a way they did not understand. The show had been contaminated by people who had not been there before. This framing required ignoring that the season they were watching was objectively the show's best work. It required ignoring that Pickle Rick was written by one of the women they were threatening. These were not things the most hostile fans were prepared to attend to. The cultural analysis of the Szechuan sauce incident that has received the least attention in the years since it occurred is the analysis of what the incident reveals about the specific economics of nostalgia in internet culture. The sauce was not valuable. As multiple commentators pointed out at the time and since, the Szechuan sauce that McDonald's used in its 1998 Mulan promotion was a teriyaki sauce available at any Asian grocery for a few dollars a bottle. The specific McDonald's version was not even especially distinctive within the category of commercially produced teriyaki sauces. Its value was entirely constructed, entirely the product of its association with a particular cultural moment, and with the show that had invoked that moment. The fan who traded his car for a single packet of sauce was not making an economic calculation. He was participating in a ritual, in the specific kind of ritual that internet culture had developed for converting scarcity, real or manufactured, into demonstrations of commitment. The sauce was not the point. The possession of the sauce was the point, as evidence of the possessor's relationship to the cultural object the sauce had come to represent. The person who had the sauce had demonstrated their commitment to the show in a form that was measurable and transmissible and could be documented and shared. Rick and Morty had, by the time the sauce incident occurred, become the kind of cultural object that generates these rituals. It had achieved the specific status of a show that people used to identify themselves to each other, to signal membership in a community of people who got the references, who understood the jokes, who were, by implication, the kind of people who watched this kind of show. This is a common enough dynamic with cult objects, but Rick and Morty had developed it with unusual intensity, partly because the show's pretensions to intellectual sophistication had made the community identification particularly loaded. Watching Rick and Morty was not just watching a show. For a significant portion of its audience, it was a statement about who you were, about what kind of person you were, about where you fit in the landscape of intelligence and humor. The Sauce Riot was that identity structure colliding with the reality of its own triviality. The identification had become so intense, and the desire to perform it so pressing, that when McDonald's offered an object associated with the show, the object became a mechanism for enacting that identity, for proving through possession and through the effort expended to obtain the possession how real the commitment was. That the effort expended included a minor riot, that people had been pushed and shoved outside a fast food restaurant over promotional condiment packets was in some sense exactly what the show would have predicted. Rick was always telling Morty that his relationships and his values were trivial. The audience was demonstrating, in the parking lot of a La Brea McDonald, that they had not understood the irony. The question of Adult Swim's institutional culture and its role in the controversies that surrounded Rick and Morty deserves more direct examination than it usually receives. The network is consistently present in these controversies as a kind of background structure, the institution that made decisions about how to respond to each controversy as it arose, and that bears responsibility for the environment within which the controversies were possible. Adult Swim's late-night programming block had been, since its founding in 2001, a space for adult-oriented animation that pushed content in directions the main Cartoon Network brand would not permit. The network had built its identity on irreverence and transgression and the specific aesthetics of content that was for adults in a way that primetime network television was not. This identity had produced remarkable creative work, including shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and Metalocalypse and the Venture Brothers, all of which found specific and devoted audiences by doing things that were genuinely unusual in the television landscape. The same identity had also produced a culture in which certain kinds of content were normalized. Certain kinds of behavior were tolerated, and the question of who got to make content under the Adult Swim banner had a specific answer that was visible in the numbers. The 2016 programming slate had 0 female creators. The reported statement from a senior executive about women in writers' rooms generating conflict rather than comedy reflected a real culture rather than an aberration within an otherwise healthy one. When Adult Swim brought in diverse writers for Rick and Morty's third season, it was doing something that ran against the grain of its own institutional culture. The harassment campaign against those writers was not, in that context, a surprising development. It was a predictable consequence of the specific kind of culture the network had cultivated. The fans who believed that the show belonged to male writers and male sensibility had not invented that belief entirely on their own. The network's own history had modeled it for them. Adult Swim's responses to the various controversies involving Harmon and Froylan were calibrated and pragmatic, rather than principled in any way that held across the different situations with consistency. Harmon was retained after 2 separate public controversies in the same year. Froylan was severed within 2 weeks of criminal charges becoming public. The consistency, to the extent there was any, was not about a coherent set of principles about accountability. It was about a risk assessment, about what each situation required in terms of the network's exposure, about the specific calculations that large media companies make when deciding how to respond to scandals involving their talent. This is not necessarily a criticism. Corporate responses to personnel situations are not the same as moral verdicts, and expecting them to function as moral verdicts is its own kind of error, but it is worth naming the nature of the institution whose responses shaped so much of how these controversies unfolded. Because the pretense that large media company decisions about talent represent principled accountability is itself a form of misinformation. Beyond the controversies involving the creators and the fan base, the show itself generated a sustained and interesting debate about its content across its entire run that deserves its own extended discussion. Rick and Morty operated throughout its run in a very particular zone of dark content that was always being negotiated and renegotiated by the show itself. The violence was graphic and consistent and almost always deployed for comic effect, which created an ongoing question about whether the show's relationship with violence was reflexively critical, genuinely celebrating violence as spectacle, or simply habituated to it in a way that was neither critical nor celebratory but simply normalized. The best answer is probably that the show was different things at different times, that some episodes were genuinely using violence to make points about consequence and moral responsibility, and that other episodes were deploying violence with the casualness that comes from having established it as part of the show's aesthetic texture. The episode in the first season that ends with Rick and Morty burying alternate versions of themselves who have died in an unrelated accident, and then assuming those alternate selves' identities, is one of the most discussed moments in the show's run in terms of what it says about the show's relationship with the weight of death and consequence. The scene is played as a dark comedy beat, a grim comment on the interchangeability of individual identity in a multiverse, and it mostly works as exactly that. But it also requires the audience to watch Morty, a 14-year-old boy, dig a grave for his own body and lower himself into it. The tonal navigation required to make this land is considerable, and the show does make it land, but the specificity of what is being depicted is worth sitting with. The show's engagement with questions of consent and autonomy in the context of its science fiction premise generated particularly complex discussion. The multiverse framework gave the show enormous latitude to explore what happens to moral responsibility when your actions in one dimension can be undone by the existence of other dimensions where they did not happen, when memory can be erased, when alternate versions of characters can be manufactured and then discarded. The show used this framework at different points as a genuine vehicle for philosophical inquiry into the nature of moral responsibility, and as a way of generating situations whose implications the show then declined to examine. The best episodes took the framework seriously and pushed it toward genuine conclusions. Less successful episodes used the framework as a permission structure for content that the show was not actually committed to examining. The episode that attracted the most consistent content-related discussion across the show's run, the scene in Me Seeks and Destroy, established a standard that the show itself inconsistently met. Having demonstrated in its 5th episode that it was capable of treating genuinely dark material with genuine seriousness, the show was held to that standard by a portion of its audience and by critics who were paying attention to it. When the show fell short of that standard, the contrast was sharper than it would have been for a show that had never established the standard in the first place. The specific failures were often in the show's treatment of female characters. Beth's arc, which involved one of the more sustained explorations of female ambition and desire for selfhood in the show's run, was also an arc that was intermittently condescending toward its own subject in ways that were difficult to reconcile with the show's stated critical intelligence. The recurring use of female characters as objects of Rick's contempt or desire, without the same depth of examination that the show brought to its male characters, was a consistent critical note in the show's reception from the third season onward. These content criticisms coexisted with genuine admiration for the show's achievement, and the best of the critical engagement with the show held both things simultaneously rather than using one to cancel the other. The show was capable of real insight and real craft. It was also capable of laziness and carelessness. Both were true, and the controversies over content were, at their most useful, attempts to articulate the difference between the show at its best and the show at its worst. The recast of Rick and Morty's lead characters was, at the time it happened, without precise precedent in animated television. There had been recasts of individual characters in long-running animated series before, usually when a voice actor died or became unable to continue. But the specific situation of recasting both lead characters of a show simultaneously, following the removal of the performer under the circumstances that surrounded Roiland's departure, was genuinely novel. The process of finding the new performers involved what Adult Swim described as auditioning thousands of potential replacements, a process that lasted months and that was conducted with a level of secrecy that was unusual even by the standards of a production that had always been relatively careful about keeping internal developments out of public view. The choice of soundalikes rather than celebrities was not the obvious choice from a marketing perspective. A celebrity casting even someone who did not particularly sound like the characters would have generated enormous press attention and might have been more effective at signaling a clean break from the Roiland era. The choice of soundalikes was instead a choice about continuity, about the specific argument that the characters were real enough in their own right to survive a change, the voice giving them expression. Ian Cardone came from a background in voice-over work for live events and promotional content rather than from animated series. Harry Belden had done small roles in television but was also not primarily known as an animation voice actor. Both of them, in their subsequent interviews, were remarkably thoughtful about the nature of what they had taken on and about the responsibility it carried. They had both been fans of the show before they were cast in it. They understood exactly what they were stepping into and exactly why the circumstances of their casting were as complicated as they were. The critical reception of season 7 is worth examining carefully because the Rotten Tomatoes scores it generated were so dramatically lower than any previous season that they require explanation. A drop from scores in the low 90s for critical reception and mid 70s for audience reception to 63% critical and 33% audience is not gradual decline. It is the kind of drop that involves external factors, and in this case, the external factor most visible in the pattern of the audience scores was organized review bombing, the practice of coordinated negative reviews from people who are making a statement rather than evaluating the work honestly. Some portion of the audience genuinely found the new voices too different to accept. Some portion found the season's writing weaker than previous seasons on its own merits, and some portion was expressing, through negative reviews, their disagreement with the decision to remove Roiland from the show regardless of the reasons for that decision. These three groups overlapped in complicated ways, and the resulting aggregate scores did not cleanly reflect any single one of them. The best individual episodes of season 7 were, by the assessment of critics who were not primarily responding to the recast situation, genuinely strong pieces of work. The final episode of the season received particularly strong reviews, demonstrating that the creative team's capacity to produce work at the level of the show's best had not been destroyed by the disruption of the previous year. Season 8's development, proceeding faster than any season since the early years of the show, suggested that whatever the long-term consequences of the Roiland departure for the show's creative character, the practical consequences for production efficiency were positive. The coordination that had made every season a negotiation between multiple competing commitments had been replaced by a more straightforward process. This did not guarantee better work, but it created conditions in which the people whose job it was to make the work had more control over the conditions of its making. What Rick and Morty was actually about when it was working is worth articulating directly because the controversies around it have sometimes obscured the substance of the show's genuine achievement. The show was about the specific experience of loving someone whose damage makes them dangerous to love. It was about the way care and harm can coexist in the same relationship, the same person, the same moment. It was about the specific cruelty that extremely intelligent people are capable of. The cruelty that comes not from malice, but from the particular way that high intelligence can simultaneously see the truth of a situation and use that truth as a weapon. Rick knew, always, exactly what would hurt most. He deployed this knowledge inconsistently, sometimes to protect and sometimes to destroy. And the show was honest about both the protection and the destruction, and about the fact that they came from the same place. The relationship between Rick and Morty across 6 seasons and then into the recast 7th and beyond was a sustained examination of what it means to be in a relationship with someone whose love for you is real, and whose capacity to damage you is equally real, and whose ability to tell the difference between loving and damaging in the moment is unreliable. This is not an abstract philosophical problem. It is the problem that a significant number of human beings are navigating in various configurations of their lives. The show's willingness to take it seriously, to let the damage be real damage and not just comic exaggeration, and to let the love be real love and not just sentimentality, was what made the best episodes of the show meaningful in a way that outlasted the last. The character of Morty, who is often described as the show's emotional center, is in some ways the more interesting subject of the show's examination than Rick, precisely because Morty is the person the damage is happening to in real time. Morty follows Rick not because he lacks other options, but because the connection to Rick is, for him, a form of meaning that he cannot find elsewhere. The adventures are often terrible. The cost to Morty of each season's events is considerable, and yet the episodes that work most powerfully are the ones in which the show demonstrates that the connection itself, damaged and asymmetrical and sometimes exploitative as it is also genuine, and that Morty's choice to maintain it is not simply submission, but something more complicated and more defensible. The show was asking, through this relationship, whether love is enough when it coexists with damage, whether the person who loves you genuinely but damages you is worth staying with, and what staying or leaving would mean, and whether those are even the right questions to ask about a relationship that does not fit neatly into conventional categories. These are serious questions. The show asked them seriously, in the midst of all the absurdist science fiction and the burping and the mass death and the sauce joke. That coexistence of the profound and the ridiculous was not accidental. It was the specific register the show had developed for talking about things that were too real to approach directly. The best episodes demonstrated that the register worked. They demonstrated that you could arrive at a genuinely moving statement about love and damage and the cost of intelligence through the story of a burping scientist and his anxious grandson traveling between dimensions. The worst episodes demonstrated that the register could fail, that the absurdist surface could become a way of avoiding rather than approaching the difficult material underneath it. Understanding which kind of episode you are watching requires paying attention in a way that not all of the show's audience was prepared to do, and the controversies around the show were, in part, the consequence of that unpreparedness, meeting content that was designed to require it. The specific character of Channel 101 as an institution shaped Roiland's instincts in ways that are directly visible in the early episodes of Rick and Morty. The festival selected for content that was willing to be polarizing, that was more interested in producing a strong reaction than a comfortable. Roiland spent years submitting work to this environment and receiving immediate feedback from a live audience. The experience of showing something that you have made to a room full of people and watching them either commit to it or reject it in real time with no possibility of adjustment or mediation cultivates a specific kind of creative confidence. You learn, over time, to trust the things that land even when they are strained, and to let go of the things that do not, even when you were attached to them. This is visible in the way Rick and Morty handles its most unexpected tonal shifts. The transition in Meeseeks and Destroy from the comic Meeseeks subplot to the bathroom scene is not prepared in any conventional way. There is no gathering darkness, no shift in the music, no signals that tell the audience to prepare for something different. The shift is abrupt because that is what the moment required. A more careful or more conventional show would have protected the audience from the abruptness. Rick and Morty trusted the abruptness the way a creator who has spent years at a live festival trusts what he knows about how a room responds. The same confidence, sometimes overextended into carelessness, shows up in the episodes that work less well. The show sometimes trusted its audience to follow a tonal shift and was wrong about where the audience was. The most criticized episodes in the show's run tend to be the ones where the show assumed the audience was prepared for something it was not, or where the confidence in the show's own register led the writers to skip work that the audience needed them to do. The festival culture also shaped the show's approach to consistency and to the conventional obligations of serialized television. Channel 101 was monthly, which meant that continuity between submissions was a practical difficulty and often irrelevant to whether a given submission worked. The instinct this cultivated was to make each episode as complete as possible in itself, to make it work whether or not the audience was following a longer arc. Rick and Morty inherited this instinct. The show's episodic quality, the sense that each episode is trying to do something specific, regardless of where it falls in the season, is one of its genuine strengths. It is also, in some seasons, a structural inconsistency, a resistance to the demands of long-form storytelling that the show was also trying to do. Dan Harmon's specific contribution to the development was structural in ways that complemented Roiland's instinct. Harmon had developed a deep commitment to what he called the story circle, a structure based on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey adapted for episodic television. The structure is simple in description and demanding in application. A character begins in a zone of comfort, has a need they are not fully conscious of, crosses a threshold into unfamiliar territory, encounters challenges and allies, acquires what they need at the cost of what they wanted, returns transformed, and the transformation either resolves or deepens their original. The structure is not a formula that produces good television automatically, but it is a framework for asking the right questions about why a story matters, what it is actually doing for the people watching it. Rick and Morty's best episodes are structured stories in this sense. They put their characters under pressure that reveals something true about who they are, and they let the revelation change something. The worst episodes are episodes where the pressure is present but the revelation is missing, where the situation is interesting but the structure has been abandoned in favor of the surface pleasures of the genre element. The balance between these two tendencies was one of the central creative negotiations of the show's entire run. The fandom controversy, which is to say the sustained and serious problem of a portion of the show's audience behaving in ways that were harmful to real people, requires more direct examination than it usually receives, because the convenient framing of it as simply a matter of toxic fan behavior obscures the specific mechanisms by which internet culture generates these phenomena. The Rick and Morty fan base did not arrive at its worst behaviors through a simple process of fans going bad. It arrived there through a specific sequence of cultural conditions that have been documented across multiple fandoms in the same period. Conditions that the show's particular qualities made especially intense. The first condition was the hiatus. 2 years without new material from the source meant 2 years during which the community's relationship to the show was mediated entirely through community-generated content, community argument, and community memory. The show itself was not there to complicate the community's understanding of it. The community's understanding could drift freely in any direction, constrained only by the prior material and the community's investment in specific readings of that material. The second condition was the show's intellectual prestige. Rick and Morty was widely discussed as a smart show, as a show that rewarded intelligence and attention, as a show that was for people who were capable of engaging with its complexity. This prestige was then used by a portion of the community as a credential. Being a fan of Rick and Morty, in this logic, was evidence of intelligence, and the intelligence that the show rewarded was the same kind of intelligence that justified contempt for people who did not understand it correctly. The third condition was the specific character of the Rick Sanchez meme, which presented the fantasy version of the character without the show's critical framing, and which was absorbed by people who found in it a validation of their existing sense of intellectual superiority. These people were then prepared to defend that validation against any content that seemed to complicate or challenge it. When the female writers arrived for season 3, they became the target for all 3 of these conditions simultaneously. They were a change that arrived during a period when the community had established strong convictions about what the show should be. They were perceived by the people already predisposed to this perception as evidence that the show's intellectual prestige was being diluted. And they were, from the perspective of people who had invested in the meme version of Rick's contempt for weakness and sentiment, exactly the kind of change that the show's worst fans were primed to resist. The specific form that resistance took, doxing and death threats, was extreme even by the standards of online harassment campaigns. The willingness to move from online complaint to the publication of home addresses is a specific kind of escalation that requires a community tolerance for serious harm to real people. That tolerance had been cultivating in the Rick and Morty community across 2 years of hiatus, in the specific way that online communities cultivate tolerance for extreme behavior when the emotional stakes are high and the perceived threat is framed as an existential one. None of this excuses the people who participated in the harassment. Individual moral responsibility does not dissolve into structural explanation. People who publish home addresses and make death threats are responsible for publishing home addresses and making death threats regardless of the conditions that led them there. But understanding the conditions helps understand how a show's fanbase, which had in its early years been regarded as one of the more engaged and thoughtful communities in animation, arrived at a point where its worst elements were threatening women who were making excellent television. The harassment of the season 3 writers was not a failure of the show. The show did not cause it and could not have prevented it, but it was a consequence of the specific way the show had grown and the specific gap between the show's actual content and the version of the show that had consolidated in certain communities during the years of waiting. The show was asking questions about damage and intelligence and care. Certain parts of its audience had stopped asking those questions and were instead performing answers they had already arrived at. The question of what it meant for Dan Harmon to make a public apology on his podcast in real time, while the person he had harmed was listening, is one that has received a lot of attention, but that still rewards careful examination. The Harmontown podcast was, during the period of the Gans exchange, a significant ongoing document of Harmon's life and creative work. Harmon had been recording the podcast for years, and it had become one of the more unusual long-form personality documents in the world of creative podcasting. A monthly meeting in which Harmon and his co-host and a rotating cast of guests would perform something between a comedy show, a therapy session, and a think piece in front of a live audience. The audience for Harmontown had developed a specific kind of intimacy with Harmon through years of these sessions, an intimacy that was genuine in some respects and simulated in others, as all parasocial intimacy tends to be. When Harmon chose to make his apology to Gans on the podcast, with Gans present and listening, he was doing something specific with that audience relationship. He was making the apology public, which served Gans's stated interest in vindication rather than just private acknowledgement. But he was also making it in a context where the audience had a specific relationship to him that would shape how they received the apology, where the format would create a quality of performance that a purely private acknowledgement would not have, and where the recording would become part of the ongoing document of his life in ways that a private conversation would not. Whether this served Gans's interests or Harmon's interests more is a question that Gans herself answered, at least partially, by calling the result a masterclass and accepting it. The apology worked in the specific sense that the person it was directed at received it as genuine and complete and said so publicly. Whether it also served Harmon's image management interests simultaneously is a question that can be true without invalidating the first thing. The response to the exchange, which was extensively positive in the sense that many commentators pointed to it as a model for what public accountability could look like, was sometimes naively enthusiastic about what it actually was, a 7-minute podcast apology. However detailed and however well received by its specific recipient, does not reverse the harm of years of workplace misconduct. It does not restore the opportunities that were denied or the professional confidence that was undermined. It does not compensate for the psychological cost of working in an environment made hostile by a person with power over you. What it does, when it works as this one did, is create a record of acknowledgement that the harmed person has stated they needed. Gans said she needed him to confirm that what had happened had actually happened. The apology gave her that confirmation. This is genuinely valuable. It is not everything. The distinction matters. The subsequent question, which was whether Harmon's continued employment on the show was appropriate given what he had acknowledged, was handled differently by different observers depending on what they believed accountability should look like. People who believed that acknowledgement plus the acceptance of the harmed party constituted a completed accountability process found the question answered by Gans's own response. People who believed that accountability required institutional consequence, independent of the harmed party's personal response, found the absence of such consequence troubling regardless of how the exchange between Harmon and Gans had resolved. Both positions reflect genuine and defensible value. The fact that thoughtful people disagree about them is not evidence that one side is wrong and the other is right. It is evidence that the relationship between personal accountability and institutional accountability is genuinely complex, and that the available frameworks for thinking about it do not produce consensus answers. What the Harmon-Gans exchange definitely did, regardless of these larger unresolved questions, was create a public record of what had occurred. The record exists. The acknowledgement exists. Whatever someone believes should have followed from it, the acknowledgement itself cannot be undone. The comparison between the treatment of Harmon following his two controversies in 2018, and the treatment of Roiland following the criminal charges in 2023 reveals something specific about how institutions make decisions about creative talent. Harmon was involved in two separate public controversies within a single calendar year: a public acknowledgement of sexual harassment of a subordinate in January, and the resurfacing of a deeply offensive video he had made in 2009 in July. In both cases, Adult Swim issued statements that acknowledged the problem while retaining Harmon. The show continued in production with him as its showrunner. Roiland faced criminal charges that were dismissed within 2 months of becoming public. Adult Swim severed its relationship with him within 12 days of the initial news report. The apparent inconsistency in these responses generated considerable comment at the time and since. Those who argued the responses were inconsistent pointed out that Harmon had acknowledged ongoing workplace conduct that caused real harm to a real person, while the charges against Roiland had been filed on the basis of a single alleged incident and were dismissed for insufficient evidence. Those who argued the responses were consistent, or at least defensible, pointed out that criminal charges of the specific kind filed against Roiland, felony domestic battery, and false imprisonment, represent a different category of alleged conduct than workplace sexual harassment, and that the institutional calculus for responding to each is different. What both positions tend to overlook is that the institutional responses were probably not primarily about principled consistency in the first place. They were about specific risk assessment made by specific corporate actors in specific context. Adult Swim's decision to retain Harmon in 2018 was a risk assessment that concluded the controversies, while serious, were manageable in the context of the show's commercial importance and the creative team's performance. Adult Swim's decision to sever with Roiland in 2023 was a risk assessment that concluded the charges, while not adjudicated, represented an exposure that was not manageable in the same way. The different assessments reflected different circumstances. By 2023, the show had less internal creative dependency on Roiland than it had had in its early season. Multiple people who had worked closely with the production had described his day-to-day creative involvement as limited compared to what his credit and public profile suggested. Adult Swim knew, better than anyone outside that the show could continue without his active participation, because the show had, in practical terms, been operating with limited active participation from him for some time. The calculation that severing the relationship would not damage the show's creative continuity was available to them in a way that might not have been true of a different talent in a different role. This does not mean the response to the charges was wrong or that the retention of Harmon was wrong. It means they were different decisions made in different contexts about different situations, and the apparent inconsistency is partly real, reflecting genuine unevenness in how institutions apply standards, and partly a product of genuinely different circumstances being evaluated through the same analytical frame. The show's 7th season, which premiered under circumstances that were genuinely unprecedented, requires a more careful analysis than the simple narrative of decline that its aggregate scores suggest. Season 7 aired in the autumn of 2023, roughly 9 months after Roiland's departure had been announced, and after the casting of the new voice actors had been confirmed by the premiere itself. The season had been written and produced during a period of considerable internal disruption, as the production team navigated not only the practical requirements of recasting the lead characters, but also the ongoing public attention to the circumstances of Roiland's departure and the September NBC News report, which arrived while the season was still airing, that the season was produced at all, and that it produced individual episodes of genuine quality, is itself a form of institutional resilience worth acknowledging. The writing team, under Scott Marder's showrunning, continued to develop the show's central mythology with the same intelligence and ambition that had characterized the show's best periods. Several individual episodes in Season 7 were praised by critics who were evaluating the work on its merits, rather than primarily responding to the circumstances of its production. The aggregate scores do not reflect this. They reflect a combination of genuine audience dissatisfaction with the voice changes, organized negative reviewing by fans who objected to Roiland's removal, and possibly some genuine quality issues in the season's weaker episode. Disentangling these three factors from the aggregate numbers is not possible with the available data, and attempts to attribute the low scores entirely to review bombing or entirely to genuine quality decline are both probably wrong. What seems more defensible is a reading that treats Season 7 as a transitional season, one that had to accomplish the very difficult task of establishing the new voice actors as legitimate carriers of the characters while also continuing to develop the show's narrative ambition, and that did this with uneven but real success. The season was not the show at its best. It was the show demonstrating that it could continue, that the characters were robust enough to survive the change, and that the creative team had the capacity to build towards something better. The trajectory suggested by the production timeline, with season 8 fully written during season 7's airing and the pace of production improved significantly, indicated that the structural disruption of 2023 might ultimately produce a show that was more consistently produced and potentially more consistently good than the show had been able to be under the scheduling constraints of the previous decade. Whether that trajectory has been realized is a question that only the seasons that follow can answer. There is something worth examining in the specific way that the phrase wubba, lubba, dub, dub became a kind of inadvertent summary of the show's relationship with its own worst receptor. The phrase first appears in the 5th episode of the first season, in the same episode that contains the jelly bean bathroom scene. Rick says it, and in context it reads as a nonsense catchphrase, the kind of thing an eccentric character says when they are feeling energetic and chaotic. The audience, predictably, adopted it immediately as exactly that, a nonsense catchphrase, a thing you could say to signal that you were the kind of person who watched Rick and Morty, a piece of fandom vocabulary. Much later in the show, in the 2nd season, it is revealed that the phrase is not nonsense. It is a phrase in an alien language, and it translates, more or less, to a statement that the speaker is in tremendous pain and needs help. Rick has been saying this in every energetic and chaotic moment when the phrase appears as a kind of code. The chaos is the cover. The phrase is the truth underneath the cover. He is always underneath the performance of Rick in tremendous pain. This is a beautiful piece of writing. It works because it recontextualizes every earlier appearance of the phrase retroactive, making the catchphrase that the audience had been enthusiastically repeating into a revealed distress signal. The humor becomes poignant. The performance reveals its own concealment. It is exactly the kind of thing the show did at its best, using an apparently superficial element as a carrier for something much more serious. The cultural afterlife of this revelation is interesting. The phrase continued to appear on merchandise and in fan usage after the revelation, and in many cases without any reference to what the phrase actually meant. People continued to use it as a signifier of enthusiasm, of shared fandom, of the specific kind of chaotic energy that the show's surface presented. The revelation that it was a cry for help was known by people who had watched the relevant episode and had chosen to register it. It was unknown or disregarded by people who had encountered the phrase primarily through merchandise or social media rather than through careful watching of the show. This is a microcosm of the show's broader reception problem. The show built a meaningful observation into something that looked like a catchphrase. The audience that was watching carefully received the meaningful observation. The audience that was watching the surface received the catchphrase, and the catchphrase became the dominant cultural artifact because catchphrases travel further and faster than the careful observations they sometimes contain. The show's best moments were full of things like this, things that looked one way from a distance and meant something more complex if you got closer. The controversies around the show were often the product of an audience that had not gotten closer, that had the distance version of something and was defending it against the version you could see when you paid attention. The harassment of the female writers was partly the defense of a version of Rick that the show had always been complicating, but that a portion of the audience had frozen at the surface level. The sauce riot was partly the enactment of a Rick monologue that the show had offered as irony, and that was received as sincerity. Wubba, lubba, dub, dub. The phrase means I am in tremendous pain and I need help, and everyone is saying it as a joke. The final question that the complete history of Rick and Morty's controversies poses is also the most difficult to answer, which is what we are supposed to do with all of this. The show is genuinely good. Not uniformly good, not always good, not good in every episode or every season or every decision it made about its content, but good in the way that matters, the way that means it was doing something real that real people needed, asking questions about human pain and human love and human damage that were worth asking, and that the show had the specific intelligence and craft to ask with precision. Some of the episodes in its run are among the best animated television produced in the contemporary era. The care and intelligence that went into the best of them is not imaginary and cannot be dismissed by the controversies that surrounded them. At the same time, the things that happened around the show happened. People were harassed and threatened. Women working in the writing room received death threats and had their home addresses public. A creator publicly acknowledged years of workplace conduct that caused harm to a colleague. Another creator faced criminal charges and then a detailed investigative report describing alleged conduct that his attorney denied. The Sauce Riot happened. The 2-year hiatuses during which the worst of the fan behavior developed happened. The instinct to resolve this by simply coming down on one side, either by dismissing the controversies as irrelevant to the work's value, or by dismissing the work as irrelevant in the face of the controversies, is understandable but not honest. The two things exist together, in permanent and unresolved tension, and the honest position is to acknowledge the tension rather than pretending it does not exist or that it has been resolved. There is a specific kind of conversation that happens around art made by complicated people, a conversation that seems to believe that the right answer must be either pure condemnation or pure celebration, and that any other position is a failure of moral clarity. This conversation is, at its core, a demand for simplicity in a situation that is genuinely complex, and meeting that demand by providing the simplicity is a form of dishonesty about what the situation actually is. Rick and Morty was made by people who were limited in specific ways. It was received by an audience that was, in its worst parts, willing to cause real harm in the name of a show that was explicitly against causing real harm. The show itself was trying to be honest about damage and love and what they cost. The people around the show were, in different ways, demonstrating the truth of what the show was examining. The audience was, in different ways, demonstrating the same truth. The show asks, what do you do when you love someone whose damage makes them dangerous to love? What do you do when your genius has not made you good? What do you do when the relationship that gives your life its structure is also the relationship that keeps costing you more than it should? These questions do not have clean answers. The show has never pretended they do. The controversies around the show do not have clean answers either. What they have is the same quality that the show's best episodes have: honesty about the difficulty, precision about the specific form that difficulty takes, and the refusal to offer comfort that the situation does not support. This is, in the end, what made the show worth watching for the people who were watching it correctly. And it is, perhaps, why the complete history of its controversies is worth sitting with rather than rushing past on the way to a verdict. There is one more element of the show's history that belongs in any complete account, which is the question of what the show said about fame itself and how what it said related to what was happening to the people who made it. Rick and Morty acquired, across his run, a specific kind of cultural significance that had almost nothing to do with it being a good television show and almost everything to do with what it came to represent in internet culture. The show became a credential, a tribal identifier, a way of announcing that you were a certain kind of person. This happened fast, and it happened in ways that the show could not have predicted or controlled. By the end of the second season, being a Rick and Morty fan was something you could say about yourself online and have it communicate a set of implications about your intelligence and your aesthetics and your general orientation to popular culture. This kind of cultural significance is difficult for any creative work to navigate because it transforms the work into something other than itself. It makes the work a symbol, and symbols are defended in ways that the original work cannot be, because the defense of a symbol is not about the qualities of the actual thing, but about what those qualities have come to represent. The show tried, across its run, to push back against this transformation. The most meta-aware episodes were often the ones that were most explicitly deflating the show's own pretension, examining what it meant for a property like this to be received the way it was being received. The post-credits scene in the season 3 finale, in which the returning Mr. Poopy Butthole acknowledges the long wait for season 4 and jokes about how old he will be by the time it arrives, is a kind of acknowledgement that the show was aware of its own relationship with an audience that was measuring its quality by its cultural prestige rather than by its actual content. The creators of the show were also being transformed by the show's cultural significance in ways that were not always healthy for them. Harmon, who had spent years in creative frustration before Rick and Morty's success, found himself in a position where his every word was scrutinized and his every decision was subject to the kind of public commentary that attaches to people who have become symbols rather than people. Roiland, whose prior profile had been that of a niche internet comedian rather than a mainstream entertainment figure, found himself in a position of celebrity that carried obligations and expectations and a specific kind of public accountability that his previous career had not required him to develop. Neither of them seems to have navigated this transformation entirely successfully. The controversies are, in part, the documentation of that failure to navigate. The Gantz situation was, at least in part, the consequence of Harmon having the authority that celebrity and success had given him without the judgment to use it carefully. The Daryl video resurfacing was the consequence of content he had made before the accountability of celebrity applied to him, catching up with him in a period when it very much did. Roiland's situation was, in its most basic structure, the consequence of a person having access to young fans that his fame gave him, and making choices about that access that became the subject of criminal and investigative proceedings. Fame changes the stake. It changes what you are responsible for and what you are capable of doing with the power that attention creates. The show that made both men famous was, in its central relationship, explicitly about the unequal distribution of power between Rick and Morty, about what Rick could do to Morty because of the asymmetry between them, about the specific responsibility that comes with having more power than the person you're supposed to be caring for. The show knew this. The show had always known that. Whether the people who made the show knew it in their own lives is a different and more complicated question. The answer, for both of them, in different ways, seems to be that they knew it in the work before they fully knew it in the life. This is not unusual. People are often most articulate about the things they are closest to failing at. The work sometimes gets there before the person does. This does not excuse the failures. It does not make them less real or their consequences less harmful, but it is honest about what the show actually was, which is a work made by people who understood something important and were still in the process of learning how to live what they understood. That is a human situation. It is the situation the show was always examining, and the fact that the show's creators were in it themselves is not a contradiction but a confirmation. The Emmy Award that Rick and Morty won in September 2018 for Outstanding Animated Program deserves extended attention, not because the award was unexpected, but because of when it arrived and what surrounded it. The Emmy was awarded for the third season of the show, the same season that had attracted the harassment campaign against its female writer. The episode submitted for Emmy consideration was Pickle Rick, written by Jessica Gao, one of the women who had been doxxed and received death threats from people claiming the female writers had degraded the show's quality. The Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, in awarding the Outstanding Animated Program Emmy to a show in the same weeks that its creators were navigating the Gans situation and the Daryl video, was making an aesthetic judgment that stood in complete opposition to the aesthetic judgment being made by the harassers. This is worth pausing on. The harassment campaign against the female writers had been premised on the claim that their presence had made the show worse, that the show's quality had declined with the addition of women to the writing room, that the original all-male writing room had produced something the diversified writing room was degrading. The Emmy is a direct empirical refutation of this claim. The industry that assesses the quality of animated television looked at the season produced by the diversified writing room and gave it the highest honor available to it. The harassers were wrong about the quality. They were wrong about who had made the quality. And the specific episode that the Television Academy chose to recognize, the episode that most completely demonstrated what the season was capable of, was written by one of the women they had threatened. Jessica Gao went on to create her own show, She-Hulk, attorney at law, for Disney+, which itself attracted harassment from people with similar orientations to the ones who had targeted her at Rick and Morty. The pattern was not unique to the show. The people who targeted Gao and her colleagues were participating in a broader project of driving women out of the entertainment industry, one that played out across multiple franchises and multiple workplaces in that period. Rick and Morty was one venue for it. It was not the whole story. The Emmy ceremony itself, in September 2018, arrived in the middle of the summer's Harmon controversy. The Gans situation had resolved in January. The Daryl video had resurfaced in July. The Emmy was awarded in September. The show was being recognized for its best creative work at exactly the moment when the behavior of its creators was being most extensively examined. The juxtaposition was not comfortable, and no one tried to make it comfortable. The award was for the television. The controversies were about the people. The two things existed simultaneously without resolving into a tidy narrative. The Television Academy's judgment and the audience's harassment campaign could not both be correct about the show's third season quality. The Emmy said the season was outstanding. The harassers said it had been ruined. The harassers were wrong. This should be stated plainly, because it often is not. Because the desire to be fair to all parties sometimes extends to parties who were empirically and demonstrably wrong about the thing they were wrong about. The show's third season was its best season. Its best season was produced by a diversified writing room. The episode that best exemplified the season's quality was written by one of the women who received death threats for having written for the show. This is the complete and accurate record, and no amount of fan grievance changes it. The specific cultural moment in which Rick and Morty achieved its peak cultural visibility, roughly 2017, was a moment of particular intensity in a broader set of conversations about intelligence, identity, and what male intelligence specifically was supposed to look like in a culture that was beginning to question some of its inherited assumptions about these things. The show's nihilism, its deployment of Rick's contempt for lesser minds, its willingness to make the incompetent characters the butt of sustained jokes, all of this arrived in a cultural context in which a certain demographic of online native young men was developing a very particular relationship with the idea of being smart. The concept of intelligence had been recruited into a set of identity claims that went beyond simply wanting to be regarded as clever. Intelligence had become, in certain online communities, a credential that was supposed to exempt its holder from social obligation, from the requirements of empathy, from the necessity of deferring to anyone's feeling, from the general social contract that required acknowledging that other people's experience of you mattered. Rick and Morty's surface aesthetic, the burping genius who would rather blow up a civilization than pretend that other people's opinions were worth considering, fit this identity framework with uncomfortable precision. The show was not endorsing it. The show was, as already discussed, examining it critically across every season, showing the cost of the contempt and the damage it caused and the specific loneliness it produced. But the show's critique was only visible if you were watching the show carefully and were willing to apply what you saw to yourself. The portion of the fan base that was most aggressively investing in the Rick identity was not watching carefully and was not willing to apply what they saw to themselves. They were watching a mirror that showed them what they wanted to see, and the more the show tried to complicate what the mirror showed, the more hostile they became to the complication. This is not unique to Rick and Morty. The same dynamic played out around Breaking Bad, whose protagonist, Walter White, was clearly offered by the show as a cautionary figure and was enthusiastically adopted by a portion of the audience as an aspirational one. It played out around Tony Soprano, around Don Draper, around a whole series of morally compromised and carefully examined male protagonists who were offered as subjects of critical examination and received as permission structure. The Rick and Morty version of this dynamic was more explicitly ironic, because the show was so consciously examining what it was doing and was so transparent about its own critical distance from Rick's worldview. And yet the outcome was substantially similar. The lesson, if there is one, is that critical distance in narrative requires a critical audience, and that audiences are not uniformly prepared to engage with critical distance. The show can show you the damage. The show cannot make you see yourself in it. That work belongs to the audience, and the portion of the audience that was most loudly present in the years of the show's peak cultural visibility was, in substantial part, a portion that was not doing that work. The female writers who were harassed in 2017 were working on a show that was, in its third season, asking more directly than ever before what it meant to be a certain kind of intelligent man in a world that was beginning to ask those questions out loud. The harassment was a refusal to engage with those questions. It was the portion of the audience that had invested in the meme, Rick saying, as loudly as it could manage, that they did not want the show to ask those questions about them. The show kept asking them anyway. The role of Dan Harmon in the show's final shape, including its later seasons and its continued development after the Roiland departure, is worth addressing directly because it has sometimes been treated as secondary to the Roiland controversies in ways that obscure the reality of how the show actually worked. Harmon was, from the second season onward, the primary creative driver of the show's narrative ambition. Roiland's contributions were genuine and important, particularly in the show's earliest period and in the voice work that gave the characters their specific character. But the structural intelligence behind the show, the understanding of how story worked and what it could do, the insistence on letting consequence accumulate and on using the show's science fiction premise for genuine philosophical inquiry rather than merely for genre entertainment. This was Harmon's contribution in the most direct sense. The writing room that Harmon assembled and ran produced the show's best work across every season. The decision to diversify the room for the third season was his. The specific quality of the show's emotional intelligence, its ability to turn around from an extended sequence of absurdist violence into something that landed with genuine feeling, was a product of the writing culture he created. The show's best episodes are not impressive primarily as pieces of voice performance or of imaginative premises. They are impressive as pieces of dramatic writing, as sequences of cause and consequence and revelation that work because the structure behind them is sound. Harmon's continued presence on the show through all of the controversies that surrounded him is In retrospect, one of the reasons the show was able to continue after Roiland's departure with as little disruption to its essential creative character as actually occurred. The show had always been more dependent on Harmon's structural intelligence than on Roiland's specific contributions in the later seasons. When the production was reorganized around Harmon as the sole showrunner, it was not reorganized around an absence, but around a presence that had been the show's primary creative anchor for years. This does not resolve the moral questions about Harmon's conduct. His acknowledgement of how he had treated Megan Gans, however thorough and however well received, describes real harm caused to a real person. The Daryl video represents real content that should not have been made. These things exist alongside his genuine creative contribution and his evident talent as a television writer and showrunner, and the existence of both does not resolve into a simple verdict. The show he has been making in the years since the Roiland situation forced a reorganization of how it was produced has been a show that is proceeding with more focus and less logistical chaos than the previous decade's production history had suggested was possible. Whether the creative work being produced in this new configuration will match the heights of the show's best seasons is a question that only time can answer. The conditions for good work are in place in a way they have not always been. What the people working within those conditions do with them is the question that remains. The house that Rick and Morty built, meaning the specific culture and community that developed around the show across its first decade, is a complicated inheritance for anyone who cares about the show in the way that the best version of its audience cares. The show built a community that, at its best, was genuinely engaged with the questions the show was asking. Online forums and discussion spaces around the show, during periods when the worst behavior was not dominating them, were places where people were thinking carefully about the philosophical implications of the show's premise, about the emotional truth of its character work, about the relationship between absurdism and genuine meaning that the show was constantly negotiating. The analysis of specific episodes, the arguments about what a given sequence was doing and whether it succeeded, the attention to the details of character and structure and implication represented a kind of thoughtful engagement with television that does not happen everywhere. The same community, or rather the part of the community that was most visible in the worst moments, produced the harassment campaigns and the sauce riot and the organized contempt for creative decisions they had not been consulted about. The bad behavior was real. It was extensive. It caused harm to real people who were doing their job. It is part of the community's history and cannot be undone or minimized. Holding these two versions of the community simultaneously is the same work the show itself was doing with Rick Sanchez, seeing both the genius and the damage, neither using one to cancel the other, nor pretending the two could be separated. The show was asking how you love someone who causes harm. The community was asking, perhaps without knowing it, how you love something that attracts harm on behalf of people who did not deserve it. There is no version of loving Rick and Morty, the show, that does not include sitting with the history of what happened around. The show is inseparable from its controversies in the same way that Rick Sanchez is inseparable from his damage. You can love the thing without loving the damage. You can refuse to minimize the damage while still loving the thing. This is in fact the position the show itself kept asking its characters to inhabit, and that it kept demonstrating was the only honest position available. The show has continued. It keeps being made. The characters keep existing in new configurations of their fundamental situation. Rick keeps being more than his worst moments and less than his best self, and somewhere in between in ways that the show examines with more honesty than most narratives manage. Morty keeps following anyway, at genuine cost, for reasons that the show treats as meaningful rather than pathetic. The controversies are part of the record. The work is part of the record. Both are true. The record is not clean. Neither is the show. This is what made it worth watching. Every controversy in the history of Rick and Morty, examined in the order it occurred, reveals the same recursive structure. The show was about a specific kind of damage and a specific kind of love and the way they coexist in the same relationships and the same people. The controversies were about a specific kind of damage and a specific kind of love and the way they coexisted in the show's production and in its reception by its audience. This is either a profound resonance or a remarkable coincidence. The honest answer is probably that it is neither exactly. It is the consequence of the show having been made by specific kinds of people, received by specific kinds of people in a specific cultural moment, and of all of those specific things being, at their core, about the same questions that human beings have always been asking about each other. What do you owe the people who have damaged you? What does the person who has damaged you owe you? How do you hold the reality that someone who loves you genuinely is also someone who has caused you harm? How do you stay in the relationship, or how do you leave it? And what would leaving cost you? And what does staying cost? Rick and Morty ask these questions through the story of a burping scientist and his anxious grandson. The controversies around Rick and Morty forced these questions into a different register, where the characters were real people and the harm was real harm. The answer was not simpler in the second register than in the first. It was not simpler, and it was not cleaner, and it was not resolved by the end of any season or any public statement or any corporate announcement. The show kept going. The questions kept being asked. This is, in the end, the most accurate thing that can be said about the full history of Rick and Morty's controversy, that they are the same story the show was always telling, told from the outside rather than the inside, and that the story does not end where the viewer stops watching. Dimension Drop has been with you through all of it tonight. If you want to stay with us for whatever comes next, subscribing genuinely does help. Rest well, and we will see you in the next one. There is a specific conversation worth having about the show's 8th season and beyond, not as a prediction or a review of material not yet fully examined, but as a structural observation about what the show's survival means. Most television series do not survive the loss of their co-creator and both lead voice actors simultaneously. The ones that do survive tend to survive in a form that is visibly changed, recognizable as related to what came before, but marked by the transition in ways that audiences and critics discuss as the before and after of the show's identity. The expectation that surrounded season 7 of Rick and Morty was that it would represent exactly this kind of marked transition, a before and after that everyone would be able to point to as the moment the show became something else. Season 7 did not accomplish this in the way that the expectation anticipated, which is itself remarkable. The characters were recognizably the characters, the show's essential register. The specific way it holds absurdity and genuine emotional weight in the same moment was recognizably the same register. The things that had made the best episodes of the show's earlier seasons work were still, in the best episodes of season 7, present and operational. This is a credit to multiple things simultaneously. To the craft of the new voice actors who approached the roles with both technical precision and genuine understanding of the characters they were inhabiting. To the writers who had been developing these characters for years and who understood them at a level that did not depend on any single performer, and to the fundamental robustness of the characters themselves, which the show's best work had built to a level of specificity that could survive the transition. The characters of Rick and Morty are not defined by their voices, though their voices are an essential part of how they express themselves. They are defined by the specific quality of their relationship, by the dynamic of power and care and damage and devotion that the show had been examining for a decade. That dynamic was not owned by Justin Roiland. It was built by everyone who worked on the show across its entire run, and it was sturdy enough to continue. The production pace suggested by the 8th season's development timeline was, if it held, a meaningful structural improvement in how the show was made. A show that could produce seasons on a 12 to 14 month cycle rather than an 18 to 25 month cycle would be a show that spent considerably less time in the conditions that had allowed the worst fan quirky behavior to incubate. Regular production meant regular engagement, meant less of the hothouse atmosphere in which the community's worst tendencies had grown in the extended silences between seasons. Whether the improvement in production pace translated into improvement in creative quality is a question that requires sustained engagement with the material as it arrives. What is not a question is whether the show had demonstrated, by continuing after everything that had happened, that it was capable of a form of institutional resilience that most productions would not have managed. The show survived because the thing at its center was real. The relationship between Rick and Morty, examined honestly and with sustained creative intelligence across more than a decade of television, was real enough to survive the loss of the specific person who had originally given voice to both of them. This is, if you think about it for a moment, the show's own central argument, made manifest in the history of its production. The argument was always that connection, genuine connection, built over time through the accumulation of shared experience and mutual recognition, is more robust than the specific form any single moment of that connection takes. That Morty staying with Rick through season after season of damage and adventure, care and betrayal was not evidence of Morty's inability to leave, but evidence of the genuine substance of what they had built together. The show's survival of the Roiland situation was, in this reading, not evidence of corporate calculation or audience inertia, but evidence that the characters themselves, as creative construct, had achieved sufficient weight and specificity to carry forward in new hands. Rick and Morty is still being made. The questions it has been asking across its entire run are still being asked. The controversies are part of its history, indelible and important, and not subject to being minimized or erased by the continued quality of the work. The work is also part of its history, equally indelible, equally important, equally not subject to being erased by the controversy. Both things are true, and the history of the show, in all its complexity and difficulty and occasional genuine achievement, is the record of what it looks like when both of those things are true at the same time. This is a hard place to live. The show has always known it is a hard place to live. It has never pretended otherwise. The cast and crew who kept working through 2023 deserve recognition that often gets lost in the controversy coverage. The voice actors who were not at the center of the Roiland situation, Chris Parnell as Jerry, Spencer Grammer as Summer, Sarah Chalk as Beth, had all built their own relationships with their characters across a decade of work. They went through their own process of adjustment to the new production reality. Chris Parnell, in a podcast appearance around the time of season 7, described a cast and production meeting that had taken place while the show's future was still uncertain. A meeting in which Scott Marder, as showrunner, had discussed the situation with the cast and in which the collective commitment to continuing had been formed. The description of that meeting, in Parnell's telling, was of a group of people who were genuinely invested in the work and who chose to continue making it because the work itself was worth making. This is what institutional survival actually looks like from the inside. Not corporate calculation performed at a distance, but people who have spent years building something, who are genuinely uncertain whether that something will survive the circumstances, choosing to continue building it because they believe in it. The actors, the writers, the directors, the animators, the production staff who had nothing to do with any of the controversy, but who showed up every day to make the show during the most difficult period in its history, are the people whose commitment allowed the survival of the public narrative record. Sarah Chalk, discussing the season 8 production in an interview, mentioned casually that the scripts had already been written and that the cast had not yet read them, a small logistical detail that revealed a production process running with a smoothness and a predictability that the show had rarely enjoyed in its earlier year. This is what the practical difference looked like, not in the art, but in the infrastructure. A writing process that had completed its work on schedule, scripts that existed and were being prepared for recording, a production cycle that had not been disrupted by the coordination difficulties that had stretched every previous season beyond its intended timeline. The show is still being made. The people who make it are still doing the work. The controversies are part of its record, and the work is part of its record. And the people who showed up every day to make the work through the hardest period are part of its record too. The full history is all of it together, not any single piece of it taken alone. One last thing before this essay closes, which is that the history of Rick and Morty's controversies is also, in some sense, a history of how the internet processed the experience of caring about things in the 2010. The years when the show rose to its peak cultural visibility were also the years when online fandom culture was developing its most characteristic behavior. The intense identification with fictional characters and their creators, the conviction that caring about a thing conferred a form of ownership over it, the speed with which enthusiasm could curdle into hostility when the object of that enthusiasm did not behave as expected. These behaviors were not specific to Rick and Morty. They played out across dozens of franchises and fandoms in the same period, leaving similar trails of harassment and organized negativity and occasionally actual harm to real people who had made the mistake of being visible in public-facing creative work. Rick and Morty's version of these phenomena was shaped by the specific qualities of the show's cultural position. The intellectual prestige that the show had accumulated made the community's defensive reactions more ferocious, because the investment was not merely emotional but also identified with the community's self-image as intelligent. The show's nihilistic surface, however thoroughly the show itself examined and complicated, that nihilism provided a permission structure for contempt that other fandoms had to construct more laboriously from less promising material. And the specific length and frequency of the production delays gave the most problematic parts of the fanbase extended periods of uninterrupted time to consolidate their orientation and develop their characteristic hostility. The show survived all of this because underneath the cultural phenomenon and the merchandise and the memes and the sauce riots and the harassment campaigns and the creator controversies, there was a piece of television that had genuine things to say about genuine human experiences. When the cultural noise was loudest, when the controversies were at their most intense, when the question of whether the show could survive its own history seemed most uncertain, the answer turned out to be that the work had weight enough to carry through. That is the most honest and most complete summary of the full history of Rick and Morty's controversies that Dimension Drop can offer. The work had weight enough to carry through. The controversies were real and the harm was real, and the questions they raised have not been fully answered. And the work had weight enough to carry through.